This is a CBC News Special presentation.
You are looking live at the White House, where the U.S. president is set to make good on a promise. He's a master of marketing, and he is marketing this moment as Liberation Day in the United States. His event in the White House as Making America Wealthy Again. Well, let's see what this looks like in reality. The plan has Donald Trump hitting Canada with punishing new tariffs, and not just Canada. He says he's striking back at the countries he believes have been ripping off the United States. Meanwhile, in this country's nation's capital, the Prime Minister is chairing a meeting with the Council on Canada-U.S. Relations. And after Donald Trump's announcement, Mark Carney will meet with his cabinet committee to plan how they'll respond to Washington's new measures. Hello, I'm Adrienne Arsenault. Welcome to our breaking coverage of Trump's latest salvo in the ongoing trade war with Canada. The announcement of his sweeping trade policy is scheduled for 4 o'clock Eastern. That's not a coincidence. That's after the markets have closed. It's 1 hour from now, and it will be in the Rose Garden. The tariffs will take effect immediately. Keep in mind, what he says may not be what he does. The truth of what's about to happen to this country will be buried in the language of the executive orders that will be pored over meticulously. You know the anxiety. Potentially, we're talking about actions that could throw this country into recession, possibly resulting in the loss of something like 160,000 jobs by one count. But we're not there yet. So let's take this step by step. We have a team to guide you through this pivotal day. Our chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton, Power and Politics host, David Cochran, and the CBC senior business correspondent, Peter Armstrong, will offer the context and insight we so desperately need. And of course, Andrew Nichols is here, still here, right with us, tracking the latest developments and reaction. I know you have all the screens going. You're keeping an eye on what's happening, if we can make sense of it. We also have reporters on location with the latest information and reaction. Katie Simpson's at the White House. Sarah Levitt, looking charming there, is at a food factory in Laval. And Lindsay Duncombe is tracking the concerns from British Columbia's lumber industry. So why don't we begin in Washington? That means going to Katie Simpson. Katie, you're at the White House. You know, give us a brief. What are we expecting next hour?
Adrienne, it's sort of a surreal moment right now. There's this protester who sets up outside the gates of the White House and he plays different national anthems. And just as you were throwing to me here, he finished playing the Canadian national anthem, this weird sort of moment as Canada is waiting for any sort of details from the Trump administration about just how bad this could possibly be for Canadian workers, for Canadian businesses and the Canadian economy. At this point, even though we are less than an hour from when this major event is supposed to take place, we don't really have a sense of what Donald Trump has decided. There have been all kinds of reports about different options and methods that Donald Trump is examining. We've seen some members of his inner circle, key advisors on the tariff agenda, sort of coming and going from the Oval Office area. We saw Peter Navarro just a short time ago, a sign that these negotiations continue to be active, these discussions. As of this morning, we understand that Donald Trump was still in the process of finalizing exactly what it is he's going to do today. He has promised that today would be Liberation Day, as he calls it. He's going to announce a series of reciprocal tariffs. He says these are tariffs based on fairness. And so they will be looking at whether a country imposes tariffs or taxes on American goods. That could be one reason that, you know, the United States targets a country. Another is if a country has policies that the Trump administration deems unfair to American businesses. And they've sort of, you know, pointed to a few things. Things like certain kinds of taxes, a VAT tax, a GST, those kinds of things. Or if they have policies, again, that they think are unfair to American workers. Those are all reasons the Trump administration feels a need to retaliate, and this is supposed to be the moment when those details of that retaliation are going to be made public. Now, of course, Canada has so much at stake here. Canada has been told it will be hit with one of these new tariff rates. There had been signals late at the end of last week that perhaps Canada might get a lower tariff rate than some other countries. But again, you have to remember, Donald Trump has gone after Canada aggressively, describing it as one of the worst when it comes to trading partners. Oftentimes, when Donald Trump is holding a public event, without any prompting, he'll bring up Canada and attack the Canada-U.S. trading relationship, complaining that, there's integration when it comes to the auto sector, those kinds of things, complaining about protections around the Canadian dairy industry. So Donald Trump, even though he's made those really aggressive complaints, really singled out Canada as a target. The expectation in this moment, at least what we're hearing from Ottawa, is that possibly that Canada could be sort of on the lower end of that scale. But complicating everything so much further, Adrian, is all of these other tariffs that are at play. Remember, Canada has been hit with this 25% blanket tariff and 10% tariff on Canadian energy. Now, there were some major carve-outs in that. Anything that's compliant under the USMCA or CUSMA, as we call it in Canada, there are some exceptions around there, but there's some confusion if that expires today or if it's going to be renewed or what's going to happen around that. And then Canadian businesses are still trying to navigate that 25% tariff on steel and aluminum. So it is complicated. It will be our job today to try and get some clarity around this. Just before 4 o'clock, I'll actually be heading into the Rose Garden. We don't know if the president is going to be taking any questions, but we are certainly going to try to position ourselves to try and ask some questions about Canada if we get that opportunity. But again, just less than an hour before this is supposed to start, we still don't know the scale and the scope of what this is going to look like.
Well, I think one thing we do know, Katie, is that this will be a show in the Rose Garden. There's a solid chance it will happen on time. That's something the U.S. president seems to like to do. He seems to appreciate start and stop times. Looking at the social media presence, the notion of this is Liberation Day and it will finally set things right for Americans is sort of coursing through that ecosystem. So expecting a lot of heat, maybe not a lot of light, and people are just going to put on their glasses, roll up their sleeves, and check out the fine print later. And we'll get back to you. Thank you, Katie. That's CBC's Katie Simpson at the White House. So we need to get some initial thoughts from our resident tariff experts. Who knew that would be in the job description? Rosemary, what will you be listening for when he steps up to the microphone?
I don't expect that anyone on this side of the border, certainly no one inside the Canadian government, expects to get answers from Donald Trump in the Rose Garden. They expect to get, as you said, Adrian, a lot of bluster, a lot of rhetoric, and a lot of talk, big talk about what he's trying to do for the United States here. And that is why you will see a Canadian government response will come at a later time. Too often, the Canadian government has heard things from Donald Trump and then seen the executive order and seen the two things be out of step. So there'll be a very careful approach here in terms of what the Canadian government will do. But here are some things we do know. The Prime Minister Carney, spoke to the president last Friday. He told him that he would retaliate, that there would be counter tariffs. And we know the Canadian government has already responded to the steel and aluminum tariffs, to the other tariffs that were put broadly on goods not approved under CUSMA. So that brings us up to $60 billion in counter tariffs. There remain another $95 billion on a list that the Canadian government has already identified. So they could go there. But we know that they want to be very careful. Prime Minister Carney has talked about he doesn't believe we can go dollar for dollar. He doesn't want Canadians to feel pain. He wants Americans to feel pain. And he's also said that he believes that this cannot go on forever, that there is a limit to what Canada can do in terms of retaliation, given what it would do to our own economy. So this is all happening, of course, Adrian, on Election Day 11, right? So the Liberal leader has stepped back into the Prime Minister's office today, as you said, meeting at this very hour with his Canada-U.S. Council. And these are a variety of people, business people and premiers, and is meeting at 5:30 with his cabinet to decide on what those next steps will be. But he has proven already to elicit a change of tone from Donald Trump. And that has caught the attention of people. And not surprisingly, the Prime Minister, also the Liberal leader, is using that on the campaign trail as he positions himself for Canadians as the best to take on the president.
Okay. All right, Rosie, interesting what you said about there's only so far Canada can go in terms of retaliation, but I think a lot of Canadians think there's another R word here, which is resilience. You know, like, what is Canada going to do to punch back? But also, what is Canada going to do to make itself more capable of facing these blows? So lots of questions ahead. We'll get back to you a little later. Thank you, Rosie. Let's bring in David Cochrane now. So, David, in addition to the details that Katie and Rosie offered, I'm curious what interests you in terms of what you're listening for.
Well, Adrian, first of all, happy Liberation Day to those who celebrate, which in this country is absolutely nobody.
No, and also, like, just not to interrupt, but in Canada, Liberation Day sometimes refers to the Second World War and how Canada helped contribute to liberating the Netherlands. So that's a phrase, Liberation Day, that has very different meaning here.
Yes, and here we are on this version of Liberation Day. In the first week of the third straight month, wondering precisely how much a historic ally is going to harm the national economy. Right? It was February 2nd, it was March 4th, it is now today. And, you know, the stakes are absolutely enormous. I mean, you mentioned one R word there of resilience, the other R word is recession. That if Donald Trump follows through on this, we are talking about near certain economic contraction, depending on the size, scale, and duration of what it is that he is proposing. Looking at negative economic growth, which is sort of the disaster area for an economy that has already been sort of plagued with sort of slow growth after the slingshot into the rebound coming out of COVID. It's sort of plateaued and been flat for quite some time now. And you're talking about potentially 10% unemployment with job losses north of 150, 160,000, again, depending on how far this goes. And layered on top of all of that, Adrian, is this what seems to be now a permanent fracture in the most successful economic partnership on Earth. The cross-border trade on a daily basis between Canada and the United States is the economic envy of just about every other economy on Earth. Just the ease of flow and the interconnectedness and the shared prosperity and wealth and opportunities that it has created really since the post-war era, then with the Auto Pact, then with NAFTA, and now with the renegotiated trade agreement. Yes, there are problems. Yes, there are challenges. But broadly, it has worked to elevate the standard of living right across the continent. And this is all happening, as Rosie said, in the middle of an election campaign where it has put the parties under the test on how to respond to this, what to do about this, but also has just completely changed the focus and issues that people are thinking about in the middle of a national election. So here it is with Trump once again being the solar eclipse that casts a shadow over all other issues as he continues his dominance as the main character, not just in American politics, but in Canadian politics and really in global politics, as he has made it his goal to be as disruptive and as intrusive and as important as possible in almost every big issue on the planet right now. And Canada, which just a few months ago must feel very much like we were standing around minding our own business, have now been smacked quite hard with the tariff stick 3 consecutive months, with maybe the biggest swing coming at some point today.
Yeah, you have to wonder if the ultimate goal ends up being just to renegotiate CUSMA. Why not just ask to do that as opposed to all this? We'll see what happens. Certainly, we're about to hear from Peter Armstrong, and I know he has said in the past that there are corners of the United States that absolutely believe that for the short-term pain, the objective here is to just draw more businesses to the United States. And there's some indication that maybe that's already started, but we'll see. All right, David, we'll check in when we know a little bit more. Speaking of Peter Armstrong, I know Peter's standing by. Do you have any intel in terms of what Make America Wealthy Again might look like and what we might hear of in terms of both tariffs and concerns about non-tariff barriers?
Yeah, so I mean, we've been getting all these dribs and drabs of information, and these non-tariff barriers is a list of things that came out yesterday that are yet more concerns, and each piece of this gives us a little bit of information. And all that information, Adrian, is important on this day because, you know, David mentioned we had Inauguration Day, then we had February 1st, February 4th, March 4th, whatever this is. On each of those, we had a fairly decent sense of what we were expecting. Even as late as last night, Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, like those with real insight into the Commerce and Treasury departments were saying this administration still had no firm plan as to what was going to be announced today. And so we can take those non-trade, non-tariff barriers, stuff like they raised the language issues of labeling in Quebec, though they certainly don't seem to raise that anytime they're shipping stuff to Germany or to anywhere else in the world that speaks a different language. But it's all these little nuggets. And I think the important thing that Canada gets out of those little nuggets of information is you kind of pile them up on the corner of your desk, because we do know at some point there is going to be some kind of a negotiation. You've talked about, let's just move up the date of USMCA, of CUSMA, of the renegotiated NAFTA, whatever it is. And that makes a certain amount of sense. But I think that there is this struggle within the administration of different people are trying to accomplish different things. And when you say, yeah, let's move ahead the date of NAFTA, well, that doesn't address what sort of Peter Navarro was talking about and dealing with, just trying to raise money to cover the tax cuts. Well, that doesn't really address what Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, is talking about. So you've got these different forces that are pushing and pulling. And just this week, we're starting to see some fraying in those relationships. We saw Politico and the New York Post yesterday writing that Howard Lutnick is starting to rub people the wrong way. And what we get out of that is a sense that maybe they're starting to get some fraying of those relationships, and maybe they're trying to look for somebody to blame this on if indeed it goes badly. Remember, this was scheduled, as you say, for 3 o'clock. They moved it to 4 so they wouldn't have to deal with the small box in the corner showing how the Dow Jones Industrial Average was tanking as they made this announcement. There's a lot at risk here, and they have built this up to be a really big day, a really important day for not just American trade policy, but for global trade policy and the way we've been doing business around the world for 70 years. If this announcement ends up being just another punting or kicking the can down the road, there's going to be some pushback on that, not just from within the administration, but their allies, the people that support them in this, in whatever part of this they support. It's going to be a really interesting day, and there's going to be a lot of, I guess, Rosie sort of hit it. What we'll be watching for is the fine print, and the fine print's going to tell us quite a lot more than the actual announcement and the actual bluster.
So you brought up the markets. I got to ask you, because the markets certainly, we've talked about this for a long time, that for a time it was interpreted that Donald Trump saw the markets as a type of popularity poll on him. Now he's saying he's not looking at them all that carefully because the signals they're sending haven't been all that positive for his moves of late. But how are they responding today? What are you expecting to see from them?
So it's an interesting day on the markets in that they went up quite solidly. They dipped a little bit at the open, and then they went up, and they were climbing. And as we got closer to this 4 o'clock deadline, they started to fall again. We're still mostly in positive territory, but like 0.2% up, 0.3, 0.6% for the NASDAQ. And remember, that's just today. If you scale back to the beginning of this year, or to even the beginning of this term, when Donald Trump was elected, the markets took off. They soared with this belief that he was going to bring in economic growth. He was going to be the architect of deregulation and tax cuts that were going to spur on the economy, and everything was going to be great. Markets didn't believe that he was going to see through this threat on tariffs. And as soon as they started to believe that, well, maybe he is serious, and then tariffs started getting imposed and said, well, maybe these are going to stick around, you could see all of those markets started to wipe out the gains that they had made. We're at negative on the year to date. We've wiped out all the gains that have been made since markets took off when he was elected. For the moment, they are still in positive territory. But the thing the people in the administration are watching much more than markets right now is the yield on the 10-year bond. They're trying to pull that down so they can renegotiate some debt. That also gives them something to say, well, you guys worry about the stock market. We're worried about the bond market. I think it sounds better when the bond yield's coming down, and that's better news than all of this. We've wiped out, I think, $5 trillion in market value just in the last few months.
Okay, cherry picking the numbers. That's interesting. All right, Peter Armstrong, we'll get back to you a little bit later. Andrew Nichols, I know that as we wait for more specifics, and really, it's not just us. It's everybody in Ottawa. It's everybody in the world capitals in Europe. It's everyone in Mexico sitting down. waiting, coiled like cobras, ready to strike once they see what happens on the screen and taking notes. But what are you hearing from Canadians right now?
Well, I mean, it was interesting, you were talking, Adrienne, about how we've gathered some resident tariff experts to talk about this. You know what it feels like? It feels like there are 41 million resident tariff experts that are watching. They know, they're engaged, they know what's going on. I mean, they're trying to make sense of it, just as we're trying to make sense of it. But they're worried. We heard, Liberation Day, we heard Premier Doug Ford call this Termination Day because of jobs, concerns around jobs, concerns around the price of everything. What could this mean? I'll be watching to see if the Canadian support for retaliation, it's very high. The vast majority of Canadians are supportive of fighting back somehow. What does that look like going forward, depending on what happens today?
Okay. Yeah, certainly the sentiment of the elbows up, fight back is, undeniable. It's coursing through the country. The real granular detail of what that means and how ready Canadians will be to accept even more of a financial hit.
And it depends on the blow. We just don't know.
You bet. All right. Hang tight. We'll get back to you soon. This is a good idea at this moment while we wait for specifics to drill down on some of the industries that we know are feeling particularly vulnerable right now. Whenever you talk about trade between Canada and the United States, one of the first industries to come up is forestry, lumber. And in BC, forestry is completely central to that province's economy. We're talking about a $10 billion industry. More than half of BC's lumber is exported to the U.S. The CBC's Lindsay Duncombe was just in Prince George. That is the heart of lumber in BC. Lindsay, talk to us about the conversations you've been having with people there. Can they zero in on something they're most worried about?
They're worried about the survival of specific companies, whether they be big, medium, or small, and the survival of whole communities, because so many of these places in British Columbia rely on cutting down trees and selling them to the United States. We have to consider the context that any tariff anxiety is coming as we wait to see what happens today. Already, because of the ongoing softwood lumber dispute, there are duties in place for Canadian exports to the United States. That's sitting at 14.5%. The Trump administration has those set to go up to 20% in August. Then there's the worry about what could happen today. And on top of that, there is an investigation that the administration put in earlier this month, or in early March, saying that they wanted to investigate the lumber industry. So that just piles anxiety upon anxiety upon anxiety that is not going to go away regardless of what we hear on the specifics of today. And it all couldn't happen at a worse time for forestry. Already, Adrienne, we have seen lumber mills pick up and move south. A part of that is because it is simply cheaper to harvest trees in the southern United States. Canfor, the forestry giant, in the last decade has closed 10 of its 13 mills. And they moved to the United States where trees grow on plantations. They grow fast because it's warm. There are fewer regulations when it comes to how they're logged. And it's cheaper because labor is cheaper and there's not as much transportation. So you're not hauling or trucking all of those logs to mills. So add the tariff uncertainty onto that, and there is real worry. I spent a lot of time with a man named John Brink. He runs Brink Forest Products. What they do is value added. They take the odds and ends of other mills and put them together to create lumber. Goes to the United States. We were standing in front of rail cars that were set to go to Texas, and he was really worried about the industry. He got emotional. Here's what he had to say.
A lot of people will get hurt, losing their jobs, losing their businesses. I'm not afraid of myself, but yeah, a lot of people will lose their companies, especially the small and medium size.
Yeah, that's really hard to see that level of emotion. And Lindsay, I feel like when we're talking about lumber, that we've been talking about softwood lumber in particular for generations. I mean, I remember when I lived in Washington, I went to Georgia. I interviewed a man in a Georgia mill who was devastated by what the Canadians were doing, and there was a train that would go right through his yard, his lumber yard, carrying Canadian softwood lumber, which they said, look, everybody likes the softwood lumber because it's better to work with, it's lighter, it's easier to pound nails into. The tensions in this industry have been real for a really, really long time. That they're moving to the States, that's going to be hard for people to wrap their heads around. What's your sense of what you're hearing in terms of what can be done about this at this point?
People are starting to think about reframing the entire industry. Brink has said that, you know, those deserted mills that are in Vanderhoof and other communities, he wants to buy them up and repurpose them to do more than just get the wood ready to ship off somewhere else, where you could actually do some kind of value-added manufacturing here in Canada. It's something that has been talked about, but when the business case changes, then that may be something that actually stays profitable. There's the idea that we've heard in so many industries about looking for new markets. You know, already some ships out of Prince Rupert have been loaded up with lumber taken to Japan. Expanding to Asia instead of relying so much on the United States, there might be a business case for that. We also can't forget that there are some environmentalists who say, hey, you know what? Now that this crisis is upon us, maybe this is a time to rethink the forest, to actually leave it for a while and find new ways for people who are employed by the forest to be able to find different work in different industries and take a more environmental approach. But I was really struck by how existential this felt for these communities that have been through so much, that have endured so much, and there's a real fear that this could be the final straw.
Yeah, but also necessity is a mother of invention. Very creative, resilient people in this country, and they're going to figure out a way through. Lindsay, thank you, and I forgive you for standing in front of the cherry blossoms while it is snowing like stink over here. What a big, beautiful country. That's a particular flex on your part.
We have to find joy where we can, Adrian. Find joy in the crisis.
There you go. All right, CBC's Lindsay Duncombe in Vancouver. All right, so let's head back to Chief Political Correspondent Rosemary Barton. Rosie, can you talk about what the Prime Minister has been doing today to sort of get ready for, I mean, I think it is fair to say, a potentially cataclysmic announcement?
Yeah, I mean, Lindsay talked about existential. That is, I think, a feeling certainly that people have right across the country in terms of the future of Canada's relationship with the United States, as David talked about earlier. And certainly the Prime Minister, since becoming Prime Minister, which hasn't been very long, remember, has already tried to reshape and position Canada in a different place if this is indeed going to be the state of the relationship going forward. So you hear him talking about shoring up new allies and alliances, creating new trading corridors. Some of the announcements he's making on the campaign trail speak to that. Investments in the Port of Montreal, for instance. So those are things that he is doing on a political approach. In terms of what he is doing to deal with the president and the administration. As I said, he had that first call with him on Friday where both Donald Trump and Mark Carney described it as productive and constructive. However, two other things came out of that call. The Prime Minister said that he made it clear to the president that after the election, if he is still the Prime Minister, he would want to have a broad renegotiation. So we're not talking tariff for tariff. We're not talking a piecemeal conversation. This is about what is the future of a trade relationship with Canada and the U.S. And Canada believes that it cannot include tariffs. So what that looks like, we'll see. But Mr. Carney has also talked about how Canada needs to have a different economic and security relationship with the United States, meaning that there are trust issues that Canada now has with our neighbor and ally, and that those trust issues either need to be rebuilt or Canada needs to find other alliances, as Carney was seeking to do when he went to France and the United Kingdom. So the Prime Minister is preparing on all those fronts, as well as members of his cabinet who have kept these connections with members of Donald Trump's cabinet and secretaries in particular. But Again, I cannot overstate how important this day is during an election campaign. This is Donald Trump, again, overshadowing a campaign that is for Canadians. And really eating up the entire news agenda right now. That does allow an opportunity for the Prime Minister, obviously, but it also means that there's pressure on the other leaders to step up and explain how they would respond to Donald Trump. Pierre Poilievre did that a little bit this morning, talking about how he would somehow compel the president to not go ahead with tariffs in order to start a broader renegotiation. But it has completely changed the conversation in this country, and we are seeing that every single day on the campaign trail.
Yeah, no kidding. And you're seeing it out on the streets, talking with folks too. The level of engagement in this election, we'll see. The numbers will tell the story eventually, but it feels unique. All right, Rosie, thanks very much. We're about half an hour away, allegedly from Liberation Day, as the Americans refer to it, as Donald Trump refers to it, this event in the Rose Garden of the White House. We'll see what it looks like. But meanwhile, let's talk Canada. And let's talk Quebec in this moment particular, because concerns there about tariffs are twofold. So on the one hand, all importers and exporters are bracing for higher prices. But in addition to that, the Trump administration has highlighted Quebec's language laws as a barrier to trade. So we need to understand what the heck is happening there. So let's turn to CBC's Sarah Levitt, who joins us live from Laval. Sarah, firstly, where are you exactly, and what are the concerns you're hearing?
Well, first of all, I should say Lindsay Duncombe said, "Find the joy in all this," and the joy is me in this hairnet. You should see my cameraman, though; he has one for his beard as well. So. The point of me being here, though, is really to show examples of the people and the businesses affected throughout Canada. And now we're zeroing in on food products, which is a major source of exporting and importing with the United States. I'm inside Base Nuts, which makes trail mixes, nuts, dried fruit. Right now what you're seeing is actually the process of taking the raw peanuts and processing them, getting them in oil and salt and roasting them and then bringing them out. Now those peanuts, most of them actually come from the United States. So interestingly enough for this company, while their sales to the United States make up 5% of all their sales, importing is about 15 to 20% from the US. So they're impacted less so by what the Trump administration is doing, but more by the response from Canada. And I'm here now with Asaf Baruch. He's a vice president in this company. Now, we know that there's already been an impact with these tariffs, retaliatory tariffs from Canada. What are some of the solutions you've been trying to find?
Correct. So what we're trying to do, we're trying to essentially curtail all the impact of the retaliatory tariffs on products coming into Canada by finding alternative sources for ingredients to import. But we still find it a little bit difficult because the United States, in some cases, is a very strong and dominant player, and it's very difficult to find a different type of source that is also very high in quality to replace that. So in some cases, we have no choice but to continue to import ingredients from the United States.
And eating that cost.
Correct. Either we eating that cost or our margins are being impaired, or we have no choice but to increase prices to consumers, which is definitely not something that we would like to do.
Now, given that Canada, your importing is actually higher than you're exporting to the U.S., what's your response to how Canada and the federal government has been dealing with this?
Yeah, so I think Canada should not see it idly aside. We definitely need to do something. But if you ask for my personal opinion, I don't really think that the measures that are being taken now are necessarily the wise one. Because the United States, in terms of the magnitude, the size of the economy and the strength, is times over what Canadian can do. And ultimately, I think we see it, consumers on both ends of the border ending up getting hurt. So if you ask me, I think maybe Canada should employ something of more wise type of strategy that would help us not just in the short run, but in the long run as well. And what I mean by that is essentially putting some grants in place to incentivize the production manufacturing industries here in Canada, because, and I'm sure that there's going to come a day that the tariffs are going to be behind us because of the close nature that we have in the relationship with the United States. So if we invest now, we're going to gain not just in the immediate future, but also we're going to be able to benefit in terms of competitiveness and advantage in the years to come.
All right, thank you very much, Asaf. I really appreciate that. So you're seeing just a snapshot of one business in Laval, but it represents businesses across the country, not just in the food industry, agriculture, but what we're seeing and hearing from Canadians right across the country.
Hey, Sarah, while we have you there, among the many trade barriers that have been highlighted by the Trump administration is Quebec's language laws. Can you help us understand how that is playing out? Like, what is happening there?
Yeah, well, Quebec has always been a unique province within the country, and what's happened here, though, is it's coming from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and it's received official complaints from businesses, American businesses, about Bill 96. Now, Bill 96, already in place, it's meant to bolster the French language in this province, but on June 1st, another section of that law is coming into place, and that's translating French trademark into French trademarks with generic terms. And so companies from anywhere will have to do that. Americans not liking it, calling it a real foreign trade barrier.
So interesting. I think Peter Armstrong made the point that do they feel the same way about requirements in Germany or other countries? We'll have to see how that one plays out. Sarah Levitt in Laval, Quebec. Thank you, Sarah. So let's go back now to Power and Politics host David Cochrane, because you mentioned the other R word, recession, but we were talking about retaliatory tariffs. I want to zone in on resilience, though, because there's been a bit of a stretch of time between when the U.S. president was inaugurated back in January and today. And throughout the whole elbows up movement, which has some meaning for people's hearts, what has this country, what has the government done since Trump became president to make Canada more resilient in the face of new tariffs?
Well, look, you can't Trump-proof a G7 economy in 2.5 months, Adrian. There's just no way you can move at that sort of speed and that sort of alacrity, especially when Parliament is prorogued, your Prime Minister resigns, you're going through a leadership, and now you're in an election. So there have been some things that have been done in the short term to try to, at least deal with the initial shock of what has been happening, quite frankly, with the fentanyl tariffs, the steel and aluminum tariffs, and whatever comes today in the form of tariffs in terms of changes to employment insurance, in terms of the job sharing component of that, waiving the wait times, waiving the requirements to exhaust severance, setting up various financial instruments through various federal agencies to provide cash flow and liquidity to businesses that may be hit by these things, and also giving them some money to look at trade alternatives. There have also, of course, been the counter tariffs, and there has been this renewed push to bring down internal trade barriers between provincial and territorial governments and the federal government to try to amplify and boost growth, in Canada to Canada trade. But that's still got a long way to go, right? The larger conversation of what does the Canadian economy prioritize, who does it increase its trade with, how does it reduce its reliance on the United States, that's all very much a part of the conversation in the election right now. But the long-term permanent structural changes to truly make the economy resilient, that's going to be a project that's going to play out over a number of years, right? 10 weeks is just not enough time, especially with this snip, snap, snip, snap, snip, snap, on-off approach to tariffs coming from Donald Trump. You're trying to stabilize, respond, and keep things calm, but then recognizing that you've got to do something completely different based on whoever is prime minister after the 28th of April.
Well, I think it's confusing for a lot of people trying to decode the different approaches. You've got Mark Carney has one approach, other federal leaders diverge in their approaches. Is there any way you can break it down for us in the most basic sense about where their differences are?
Well, I think explain it in the political sense in terms of how it's affected the nature and flow of this election, right? It has become the dominant issue. This was going to be an election 100 days ago about change, affordability, the carbon tax, and now it's about Canada and the the U.S., how to deal with this moment and how to deal with all the moments that come after that. It has been to the benefit of Mark Carney. It has allowed him to campaign from the Prime Minister's podium, and those have been his best moments in the campaign. He's less certain on the campaign trail than a far more experienced politician like Pierre Poilievre has been. And it puts his resume and his experience front and center. And while both parties talk about rebuilding the Canadian economy to make it more resilient to these challenges, Mark Carney has very bluntly said the relationship that, as we've known it with the United States, is over. And it's time to start looking at other partners who are more reliable and can do things differently. The problem for Pierre Poilievre is that he doesn't define Donald Trump as the problem. He slots it in as one of the problems that Canada is facing. He's used phrases like knock it off as opposed to the contrast of the relationship is over. And he's really been struggling to find a way to make his response to Trump the focal point of his campaign, because this is where he's kind of struggling. So we saw something today where he talked about saying immediately after becoming prime minister, he would want to start a comprehensive renegotiation of the trade relationship. Mark Carney said words to that effect on Friday, so they're in alignment there. They both talk about building things internally in terms of resilient and getting energy projects on the go. But one key contrast point to point out, Adrian, is that Pierre Poilievre talks about taking steps to reset and strengthen the relationship with the United States, while Mark Carney is saying, we'll talk to them, but we don't know where it's going to go. We're going to look to Europe, we're going to look to Asia, we're going to look abroad. Now, Pierre Poilievre also talks about that diversification, but it's more of a focus of getting back to business with the United States, and I'm not sure how that resonates right now. And he said some things today, for example, that when you renegotiate the trade deal, whatever new money they get, he promises they will use that to boost military spending. So right off the bat, you're kind of putting a concession on the table to the U.S., right? That may be a way to satisfy Donald Trump, but recently they were talking about militarizing the border and putting 10,000 personnel on the border to deal with fentanyl in the belief that there was a threshold of appeasement that can make these problems go away. I think on Liberation Day, 3 months into this, I don't know if there's things you can lay on the table in advance that would satisfy Donald Trump. Stephen Harper has advised, in writing in the Globe and Mail that don't agree to any concession until you absolutely know what you're getting in return. And with us sitting here not even knowing what Donald Trump is going to do today, how can you offer him something to satisfy whatever the whim of the moment is? So this is the challenge. It has derailed what was a scripted plan for all the major parties. It has caused a stampede of votes from where the voting intentions were prior to Trudeau's resignation and Trump's inauguration. And we've got a very different election right here on the 2nd of April than we thought we were going to have on the 2nd of January.
Yep, and still 26 days to go. I mean, anything could happen at this point. David Cochran, thank you. So you saw Sarah Levitt in Laval, Lindsay Duncombe amidst the cherry blossoms in Vancouver. So we sent poor Mark Carcassol outside where it was snowing. Now it's raining. There you are. Listen, Mark, as the latest round of these tariffs looms, we know Canadians have been expressing their concerns. We've been getting emailed by them constantly. We've been speaking with people out in various cities. You're there in downtown Toronto now. When you approach people, what is top of mind for them?
Well, I think as soon as I approach people and I ask them the question today, Adrian, the main sort of response I get right off the bat is either just sort of nervous laughter or eye rolling, because this has gone on for so long and things are so uncertain. You even mentioned the weather out here in Toronto, how it was snowing earlier. It's raining now. It was dry when we first got out here. That's been more predictable than what's been coming out of the White House lately. And I think Canadians are really feeling that. People are tired, they're fed up, they're anxious, they're uncertain about what the future holds. They worry not just about themselves. Many of them have friends and family in the U.S. Some of them have places in the U.S. And today, Canadians are just as concerned as other countries all over the world. These are reciprocal tariffs that could affect countries all over the globe. Let's not forget. So people are anxiously watching, waiting to see what unfolds, waiting to see how this affects them and everything around them, certainly. But there's also a sense of apathy in a way. Maybe apathy is too strong of a word, but a sense of people just saying, throwing their hands up in the air and saying, I give up, I can't control this. Canadians, many average Canadians just feel trapped as politicians sort of posture and angle and politic. Have a listen.
So I think that relationships are really disturbing. It's the common public that's paying the price at the end of the day, right? So whether it's tariffs or even the retaliatory tariffs that the government of Canada plans to take, it's not the people in the offices that are going to pay the price for it. It's the end consumer that's going to pay the price. And the fear in the consumer and the general public is much more than the government itself.
You worry for everybody in the world, right? Because everything is getting more expensive as we go along, whether it be groceries, mortgage, whatever it is. So you have to worry about your fellow human.
Fellow humans. You heard the first gentleman there talk about how the relationship is now troubled. And that's a lot of what we're hearing as well. There's a lot of people out there who just can't believe that we are in the position that we are in now with the U.S., our closest ally, our closest neighbors. We take in their culture on TV and in media. And now to be in a position where we're in the middle of a trade war, one that could potentially grow after today, has a lot of people unsettled. Another thing I've noticed, too, is people seem to diverge on how to respond to this. There are many people that are happy with the strong response so far, the almost $60 billion worth in counter tariffs. Some people may understand that that can also make life very difficult for Canadians, and some may not. But there's another contingent out there that says that we need to hold back on those counter tariffs and negotiate with them, similar to what Mexico and the UK are doing, urging the government not to make it worse for our own people. And then there are others who have other ideas. Many of them have made those ideas clear in those emails they've been sending us over the last couple of months, as you mentioned, Adrian, that perhaps we should look at export tariffs, certain excise taxes, things like that. So everyone seems to have an opinion, but overall, just drained at this point.
Yeah, this feels so often, Mark, like what happens in a family when something's wrong with a family member and someone's ill and everybody disagrees on the best course of action, but everybody ultimately has the same view in mind as they want it to be better. It's very, very personal. If anybody ever thought that it's not true that politics are personal, this moment makes that very, very clear. All right, Mark Carkersole, just outside in Toronto, thank you.
Thank you.
How can Donald Trump justify imposing these tariffs legally? Let's talk about that. So for that, let's bring in Inu Manak, a fellow for trade policy at the Council on Foreign Relations, joining us from Washington, D.C. Inu, you've been with us for some of the thornier parts of this discussion over the past few months. I'm so curious, in this moment, what it is you'll be taking notes on today. What are you watching for?
Well, there's a lot to watch, and I think everyone in Washington has been refreshing a lot of their social media nonstop since this morning. Big questions we're looking out for. Will the tariffs apply to everyone or just a group of countries? How high will they be? Will they be low enough to avoid a shock to the market? And then what legal authorities will the president use to enact certain tariffs? There's a few potential ways that he could do this. You know, he likes simple, big numbers. He wants universal tariff application. And his advisors may just be able to deliver that today in the form of maybe a 15% tariff that would apply to all countries, claiming that this action is to address trade imbalances. We'll have to see what law he actually uses when he makes the announcement, but that seems likely to be one potential way that he would do this.
There was this report, that the White House put out earlier this week listing what the administration sees as the tariff and non-tariff trade barriers to U.S. exports. We talked about that a little earlier because for Canada, that list included things like Quebec's language laws, restrictions on U.S. television networks operating here. Have the cultural issues like those been used to justify tariffs in the past?
I haven't seen them used to justify tariffs, but they always are issues that become frictions in a lot of trade discussions. The United States actually brought this up last year at the WTO to Canada as a potential trade barrier. And so this is something that's been an ongoing discussion there. But I'll point out, if you look at that report that was released this week, the USTR, or U.S. Trade Representative, is taking a very broad understanding of what a tariff barrier is. He basically says that trade barriers elude fixed definitions. And I'll tell you, as someone who has studied international economic law, trade barriers have clear definitions. And so they're trying to package a lot of different things in here and claim that it's a barrier to trade.
Right. So any grievance that they identify is repackaged as a trade barrier.
Absolutely. And I think they'll essentially use a lot of different things that they're concerned about as a way to gain leverage to get other concessions for things that they want. As outsiders, we look at what's happening in the United States. You see sort of these sparks of opposition to Trump's tariffs against Canada from Democrats in the Senate. What do you make of those efforts there? It's hard to know how much weight to put on those efforts. Well, I'll say right now, I am closely watching what's going on in the Senate. In fact, they are discussing potentially taking action to rein in the tariffs that have been imposed on Canada in particular. And I think that this is a really important development because if enough Republicans do support this measure, it actually shows that President Trump doesn't have the full support of his party. And perhaps that his declining approval ratings are going to make more Republicans challenge him on this issue. So I would say it's early days, but the fact that this vote is happening today is a sign that President Trump does not have the full support of everyone in his party at all.
Is that just a symbolic effort, though, or is there any chance that changes anything? Because I presume anything that happens in the Senate is dead on arrival in the House.
Well, right now, with this measure in particular, to revoke those tariffs, it would require a joint resolution of the House and the Senate. And you're right that there would not be success in the House on this, also because the House has basically said they're not allowed to vote on anything related to the IEEPA tariffs. But there are other ways that the Congress can take action on additional laws. So if President Trump doesn't invoke IEEPA again today and invokes another law, there's definitely a chance that we'll see Congress take action there.
Okay, all right. Inu Manik, it's always great to speak with you. Inu is a fellow for trade policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. I have a feeling we will be talking again. So we are approximately 10 minutes away, presuming the U.S. president is on time, from his Rose Garden event. Let's dig a little deeper while we can into the potential short and long-term consequences that the tariffs could bring. The CBC senior business correspondent Peter Armstrong is here. So, Peter, today's announcement, presumably we're going to get some specifics in the Rose Garden, but the real meat will come from the executive orders. Certainly the uncertainty isn't going to end at 4 o'clock. What are the potential impacts that Canadians need to brace for?
Well, look, I think the biggest impact of all that uncertainty is already being felt. And everyone from, CEOs to the governor of the Bank of Canada have talked about the fact that this is not seen as a great time to be investing in Canada right now. If you're an auto plant or you're looking to build a factory somewhere, are you really looking at Canada and saying, well, that's a market where I know my access to my total available market, and I know how supply chains are going to work? You have no idea how any of that's going to work, and that's going to weigh on investment, and it's going to drive investment into the U.S., which for all the talk of reshoring, that's the thing that the Americans actually really want, is to see investment that is destined to one country bleed back into the United States. And so, our whole team in the business unit, we've got Anissa Dario talking to oil companies, and Alison Northcott's talking to steel and aluminum companies. We're talking to auto companies. We're talking to pharmaceutical companies. We're trying to get a sense of what's going to happen. And like the basic stuff of, the steel and aluminum, they've got these tariffs already in place. If new tariffs come in today, are they going to be sort of wedding cake piled up on top of those? Or is this a blanket new thing? They don't know the basics at this point. And I don't know that we'll get the basics at the end of today. It might be something that they say we're going to have a new regime in place by, May or by June or whatever the next date may be. Dave Cochran was making it very clear that we've been through a bunch of dates and we don't always get the answers that we thought we were going to get. We don't always get the announcement we thought we were going to get. And, I'm getting some pushback from people on social media about me saying earlier that as of last night, there wasn't a clear consensus as to what the plan may be. And yet it is so remarkable and so telling that after all of this time and all of this buildup to April 2nd was going to be the day for a very specific thing, even in these final hours, the administration is still trying to figure out what that specific thing is. That tells you something too.
Sure does. All right, CBC senior business correspondent Peter Armstrong. For those of you watching here, on the right of your screen, you'll see people gathering in the Rose Garden. Here's what we're going to do. When this starts happening at 4 o'clock, we're going to listen in. We don't have an embargoed copy of a speech, for example, so we don't know what he's going to say, how long he's going to spend talking about Canada. We will dip in for as long as feels relevant. If it stops feeling relevant, we may dip out. If we've missed something that matters, we'll head back in. But while we still have a little bit of time, again, let's talk about the industries here. With many industries and sectors expected to feel the impact, dairy is really important. So to break down what it means for dairy, we're going to have a chat with Tyler McCann. So Tyler is the managing director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, joining us from Ottawa. Thank you, Tyler, for helping us out here. Tyler, when these U.S. tariffs come into effect, what kind of immediate impact do you anticipate them having on Canadian farmers?
Thank you for having me, Adrian. You know, again, it's hard to know without knowing what the tariffs will actually be, but it is really important to stress that we do export quite a bit of food and processed food products to the United States. It's a major market for upwards of 80% of our processed food products. So we expect that immediately we will see prices fall down. We expect that that will kind of back its way onto the supply chain. So food processors may feel it first, but farmers will feel it shortly thereafter. And again, it really depends on the size and scale and shape of the tariffs to know how significant that impact will be, but it will be significant. Our farmers and food processors will be hurt by this.
You know, something that's confusing, Tyler, I find, is that Canada's milk exports to the U.S. are relatively low, I think. So why do you think Canada is still a target in this realm?
So you're asking me to do a dangerous thing and try and take a guess at why the U.S. is doing the things that it's doing. But we know that the tariffs that we have in place on our dairy imports that are prohibitive, that they can be more than 200%, have drawn the ire of the U.S. president. But we also know that the deal that Donald Trump and Justin Trudeau negotiated, the USMCA, has been pretty good for U.S. dairy exporters. Canadian imports of U.S. dairy products are up over 70% over the last several years. We've had some issues around TRQ compliance, but a recent study from Cornell University in the United States highlighted how good USMCA has been for U.S. dairy exporters in getting access. And so I think that idea of big tariffs has got the attention of President Trump, but that doesn't reflect the reality of the dairy trade, which is pretty good and it is a good market. It's not like the European Union, for example, that exports far more to the United States than it imports back. We're not in that position. U.S. dairy exports far more to us than we do to them.
And so up 70%. But if Canada were to allow even more U.S. dairy products into the market, what's your sense of what the risks would be for Canadian producers there?
It could be quite significant. Now, keep in mind that this is something that's likely to get dealt with through the USMCA renegotiation. And I think we've always been waiting now to see when the U.S. will move on that. That seems to not be a huge priority yet, but we know that it's coming. 2026 has got a review that will happen regardless, but there's an effort, I think, to try and move that up to start that review earlier. But many of us wonder what the value of USMCA is in the face of these tariffs that we're going to hear about later today. And it really makes you wonder, why do we go through the effort of negotiating a free trade agreement if the United States is not going to respect it itself?
Right. Listen, Tyler, thank you very, very much. That's Tyler McCann, Managing Director of the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. So maybe 3.5 minutes away from the Rose Garden event, keeping an eye on the pictures in the Rose Garden, see people are filling in the seats. It's very clearly an intent to bring in steel workers. You can't quite see it in that shot, but in one of the other ones, you can see people with hard hats. This has been, there you go. That's one of the intents of the White House, to fill it with workers as opposed to necessarily CEOs. But we'll see. We'll see who's actually there and what's actually said. And while we look at that, a quick last thought to Chief Political Correspondent Rosemary Barton. So, Rosie, can we talk about the ways in which Canada could respond?
Yeah, so the Prime Minister has obviously talked about the counter tariffs. There are $95 billion more on the table, but he's also mentioned other trade measures. He hasn't really explained further what that could mean. I don't think he means export taxes, like on energy, for instance, as has been controversially put on the table, although that remains on the table. So really, counter tariffs are the brunt of what Canada can do at this stage. But the other piece of what Canada can do, and you heard David talk about it a little bit, is to create more opportunity inside Canada's own borders. And that has become a real talking point during this election campaign, too, whether it be interprovincial trade, whether it be building pipelines, the energy corridor that Pierre Poilievre talked about, whether it be reducing taxes, all these things as a way to provide more economic growth inside our own borders to make Canada stronger without the United States. I think as you're watching those pictures there of all those workers who Donald Trump pretends to be trying to help and save, it's important to remember that one of the primary arguments the Canadian government has made to all sorts of representatives and even has billboards now in the United States saying, is that this is not just a tariff that will hurt Canada. This is a tariff that will hurt the United States. Canada is the #1 export market for the United States, and these kinds of measures will have a very immediate and damaging impact on industries right across the United States. On top of which, counter tariffs will also weaken the American economy. Most economists believe that America will find itself in a recession quite quickly. Now, Donald Trump's argument, as you know, Adrian, has been, well, we have to go through some pain in order to get to our longer-term goals, whether they be to onshore industries like the automobile industry, or to get people tax cuts so that they can live a more prosperous life. But the reality is that is not going to happen in the immediate. And so the appeal that Canadians have been making is, stop. This is going to hurt your people too. And it doesn't seem to be working, frankly. There's lots of representatives that believe that, lots of governors. The governor of Kentucky is tweeting today about how devastating this is for his state. But it does not seem to be resonating with Donald Trump because he has this longer-term goal to really totally upend the economy and bring back very targeted industries like the auto sector, like steel and aluminum. The problem is that both countries are going to suffer in the short term and perhaps in the much longer term as well.
Yep, indeed. All right, Rosie, thank you. I suspect we'll be hearing possibly from maybe some of the provincial leaders later today or first thing in the morning, certainly from Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre, I would imagine. But details, we don't have those yet. The CBC's Megan Fitzpatrick is going to join us in a sense here because she's been traveling across Ontario, speaking with voters during this election campaign in Windsor today, obviously a city known as Canada's auto capital. The Stellantis assembly plant is located right there, as well as 2 Ford engine plants, lots of auto-related manufacturers. So Megan's been trying to gauge the mood in that city as this tariff announcement looms.
It's a gloomy day here in Windsor. The weather has been miserable, raining all day, thunder and lightning storms as well. And that kind of matches the mood of some people in this city. There's kind of a sense of heaviness with these tariffs looming over people here, and in particular those in the auto sector and those who depend on that sector for their livelihoods. We've been hearing about a sense of fear and uncertainty, and we're hearing that from the city's mayor, Drew Dilkens. We spoke with him earlier today at City Hall. He's been saying that the last couple of weeks have been frustrating because of the uncertainty, and that while Donald Trump calls today Liberation Day, Drew Dilkens sees it as liberation finally from the uncertainty, when his city in particular and everyone else will learn exactly what Trump's plan is for tariffs, and then they can figure out how hard they will be hit. And this city is bracing for impact. Drew Dilkens saying the consequences of these tariffs could be absolutely dire for his city.
It could be catastrophic, and we've said that from the very beginning. So a tariff, the 25% was the original number that was proposed. It would have an immediate impact on the auto industry and the parts sector here in the city of Windsor and throughout Essex County, but that would ripple all the way throughout Ontario. It would ripple all the way into the states of Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. And so I'm concerned about my community and the job loss in my community, but I'm also reassured by the fact that if it hits my community, it's going to hit the United States, and that's where the president is going to feel the economic pain.
Dilkens saying he hopes Donald Trump doesn't follow through with these tariffs on the auto sector later today, and that if he listens to sensible advisors, then he wouldn't do that. But Dilkens noting Trump doesn't always listen to the advice that he's getting. Now, as for the people who work in the sector, we've been talking to them while we've been in Windsor, and Chad Lawton is a Ford plant worker. He's worked there for more than 30 years, and he also works for the local union here, which represents those workers. His wife works there, his 2 sons work there, and he's been talking about the fear and anxiety at the plant. He says older workers are worried about losing their jobs, about their retirement, and younger workers too are wondering if they're going to have a future in this sector. Lawton, though, saying that there is a sense of determination and that these workers are preparing to fight for their jobs, to fight to keep them on the Canadian side of the border.
The reality is, if push comes to shove and we have to fight for it, we will. And I think that there's a growing sentiment as this becomes real for many people that were hoping that it was going to go away on its own or we would talk our way through it, that these are Canadian jobs and we'll do what we have to do to protect them.
Lawton was talking about the supply chain, saying what he anticipates could happen is that the smaller companies that make parts that are needed for the engines and the vehicles, that some of those companies are smaller family-owned businesses and they might not be able to shoulder the burden of these tariffs. And if they go out of business or if they have to stop operating for a while and Ford can't get the parts that it needs, well, then that means the workers at the Ford plant don't have any work to do and they'll be laid off. Lawton saying he thinks those smaller companies might be the first dominoes to fall. Now, in terms of what they're hearing from their employer, he says not much at this point, that they've made kind of vague commitments to the workforce, but he acknowledged it's hard for the companies right now to plan when they don't know exactly what's going on either. We did talk to some workers at the Stellantis plant here in Windsor. Here's a little bit of what we were hearing in terms of how they're feeling.
It's scary, that's for sure. I mean, the thing is, with Trump over there, he's changing his mind every 2 seconds. So it's like, you know, one day you think you're working for the next like 3 months, and then the next day it's like, oh, we might be getting laid off like next week. So
we're confused. We don't know what's going to happen, but I mean, we're sticking together. We're going to get through together like we did with COVID and everything else that hit this place. We've survived, and I think we'll survive this too.
Until something actually happens, there's no sense in worrying about it. So that's all I have to say, really.
They also said a lot of rumors have been going around the plant floor about possible layoffs, maybe even as early as next week, but those are just rumors. Nothing has been confirmed by the companies. So the union saying they will be watching very closely later today when President Donald Trump holds his news conference, and they'll also be watching carefully to hear how the Canadian government is going to respond. Megan Fitzpatrick, CBC News, Windsor.
Well, Megan, thanks for that. You got to feel for people who the uncertainty is terrible when you don't know where your next paycheck is coming from. This is rough. We're keeping an eye on the Rose Garden. We know a few things. Vice President J.D. Vance is in the Rose Garden now, as is Susie Wiles, the White House Chief of Staff. We've watched lots of people who are standing there, not sitting, standing, looking off to the left. So we anticipate something happening soon. We'll keep an eye on that. While we do, we want to dig a little deeper into the potential consequences that the tariffs could bring. The CBC senior business correspondent, Peter Armstrong, who's been talking all day and will be talking for the next 400 years on this. Talk to me, if you can. President Trump has repeatedly said, I want to make, oh, you know what? Just talk amongst yourself for a second there, Peter, because they are just now introducing President Trump. So Canada, brace yourself. You're going to hear a lot of pomp and ceremony from the United States and lots of big talk. All right, let's have a listen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Nice crowd. What a good-looking group of people. Well, we have some very, very good news today, and a lot of good things are happening for our country. Please sit down. My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day, waiting for a long time. April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again. We're going to make it wealthy, good and wealthy. For decades, our country has been looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by nations near and far, both friend and foe alike. American steel workers, auto workers, farmers, and skilled craftsmen, we have a lot of them here with us today. They really suffered gravely. They watched in anguish as foreign leaders have stolen our jobs, foreign cheaters have ransacked our factories, and foreign scavengers have torn apart our once beautiful American dream. We had an American dream that you don't hear so much about. You did 4 years ago. and you are now, but you don't too often, and for many years and decades even, you didn't hear too much about. Our country and its taxpayers have been ripped off for more than 50 years, but it is not going to happen anymore. It's not going to happen. In a few moments, I will sign a historic executive order instituting reciprocal tariffs on countries throughout the world. Reciprocal, that means they do it to us and we do it to them. Very simple, can't get any simpler than that. This is one of the most important days, in my opinion, in American history. It's our declaration of economic independence. For years, hardworking American citizens were forced to sit on the sidelines as other nations got rich and powerful, much of it at our expense. But now it's our turn to prosper, and in so doing, use trillions and trillions of dollars to reduce our taxes and pay down our national debt, and it'll all happen very quickly. With today's action, we are finally going to be able to make America great again, greater than ever before. Jobs and factories will come roaring back into our country, and you see it happening already. We will supercharge our domestic industrial base. We will pry open foreign markets and break down foreign trade barriers. And ultimately, more production at home will mean stronger competition and lower prices for consumers. This will be indeed the golden age of America. It's coming back. We're going to come back very strongly. We're pleased to be joined on this momentous occasion by Vice President J.D. Vance. J.D., thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Where are you, J.D.? No, that wasn't too hard to find. I was looking, you know, he likes to take a low-key attitude, so usually we sit right in front. He's gaining a lot of confidence, Mike, isn't he? And nearly my entire cabinet is here, as well as Speaker Mike Johnson, who's done an amazing job. And with the great success we had last night in Florida, we have a majority of 7. And 7's like a lot when we had it at 1, right? You've done a fantastic job. And many of the members of the House and Senate are with us. Senators, congressmen, thank you all for being with us. We appreciate it. For decades, the United States slashed our trade barriers on other countries, while those nations placed massive tariffs on our products and created outrageous non-monetary barriers to decimate our industries. And in many cases, the non-monetary barriers were worse than the monetary ones. They manipulated their currencies, subsidized their exports, stole our intellectual property, imposed exorbitant VAT taxes to disadvantage our products, adopted unfair rules and technical standards, and created filthy pollution havens. They were absolutely filthy, but they always came to us and they said, we're violating, we should pay for it. It's all detailed in a very big report by the U.S. Trade Representative on Foreign Trade Barriers, and I'll just hold it up for you. It's available, and you don't have to pay too much. As I understand it, you'll pay nothing. It's a lot of work for something, actually, because it's a special book. It's very, frankly, it's very upsetting when you read it, when you see what people have been doing to us for 30 years. This all happened with no response from the United States of America, none whatsoever. But those days are over. Let me offer just a few examples of the vicious attacks our workers have faced for so many years. The United States charges other countries only a 2.4 tariff on motorcycles. Meanwhile, Thailand and others are charging much higher prices, like 60%. India charges 70%. Vietnam charges 75%, and others are even higher than that. Likewise, until today, the United States has for decades charged a 2.5 tariff. Think of that, 2.5% on foreign-made automobiles. The European Union charges us more than 10% tariffs, and they have 20% VATs, much, much higher. India charges 70%, and perhaps worst of all are the non-monetary restrictions imposed by South Korea, Japan, and very many other nations. As a result of these colossal trade barriers, 81% of the cars in South Korea are made in South Korea. 94% of the cars in Japan are made in Japan. Toyota sells 1 million foreign-made automobiles into the United States, and General Motors sells almost none. Ford sells very little. None of our companies are allowed to go into other countries. And I say that friend and foe, and in many cases, the friend is worse than the foe in terms of trade. But such horrendous imbalances have devastated our industrial base and put our national security at risk. I don't blame these other countries at all for this calamity. I blame former presidents and past leaders who weren't doing their job. They let it happen, and they let it happen to an extent that nobody can even believe. That's why, effective at midnight, we will impose a 25% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles. Thank you. Brian, I'd like to have you come up here for a second, okay? I just see him sitting. He's been a fan of ours, and he understands this business a lot better than the economists, a lot better than anybody. Brian, say a few words, please, would you?
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you. It's a great honor to have you. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. President. I grew up just north of Detroit, Michigan, in Macomb County, known as the home of the Reagan Democrats. My first vote for president was for Ronald Reagan. I thought that was going to be the best president I ever saw in my lifetime until Donald J. Trump came along. I have watched my entire life, I have watched plant after plant after plant in Detroit and in the Metro Detroit area close. There are now plants sitting idle. There are now plants that are underutilized, and Donald Trump's policies are going to bring product back into those underutilized plants. There's going to be new investment. There's going to be new plants built. And the UAW members, and I brought 20 of them with me, they're sitting right over here. We support Donald Trump's policies on tariffs 100%. So, Mr. President, we can't thank you enough. And in 6 months or a year, we're going to begin to see the benefits. I can't wait to see what's happening 3 or 4 years down the road. Thank you, Mr. President.
What a great guy. He got it right from the beginning. He got it before almost anybody else. This group over there, they got it too. And you know, we won the state of Michigan. We won almost all of them, but we won Michigan by a lot, and I want to just thank you all. The auto workers were fantastic. The Teamsters were fantastic. Everyone was pretty good, I will tell you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. You're going to be very happy very soon, and you probably see what's happening with all of the, not only car companies, but car companies in particular. See it with all of the ones they're moving, they're announcing day in, day out. You're seeing it. Nobody's ever seen anything like that. With today's actions, we're also standing up for our great farmers and ranchers who are brutalized by nations all over the world. Brutalized. Canada, by the way, imposes a 250 to 300% tariff on many of our dairy products. They do the first can of milk. They do the first little carton of milk at a very low price, but after that it gets bad, and then it gets up to 275, 300%. So when they're figuring what's Canada charging, they say, oh, about 2%, 3%. But take a look at what happens down the road. When you look a little bit, it's not a pretty picture, and we don't like it, and it's not fair. It's not fair to our farmers. It's not fair to our country. And with countries like Canada, you know, we subsidize a lot of countries and keep them going and keep them in business. In the case of Mexico, it's $300 billion a year. In the case of Canada, it's close to $200 billion a year. And I say, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? I mean, at what point do we say, you got to work for yourselves, and you got to, this is why we have the big deficits. This is why we have that amount of debt that's been placed on our heads over the last number of years, and we're really not taking it anymore. Through non-tariff barriers, the European Union bans imports of most American poultry. You understand? They say, we want to send you our cars, we want to send you everything, but we're not going to take anything that you have. Australia bans, and they're wonderful people and wonderful everything, but they ban American beef, yet we imported $3 billion of Australian beef from them just last year alone. They won't take any of our beef. They don't want it because they don't want it to affect their farmers. And you know what? I don't blame them, but we're doing the same thing right now, starting about midnight tonight, I would say. And China charges American rice farmers an overquota, it's called, a tariff rate of 65%. South Korea charges 50%. Actually, they charge different, from 50% to 513%. And Japan, our friend, charges us 700%. But that's because they don't want us selling rice and other things. Who can blame them, Madam Secretary? Agriculture, great job you did on eggs, by the way. The egg prices came down 50%. You got them down 50%. Once we got involved, they were going through the sky. The egg prices, they were going through the sky, and you did a fantastic job. Now we have lots of eggs, and they're much cheaper, down about 59% now, and they're going down further. We charge 2.8% for so many things that other countries are charging 200%, 300%, and 400% for. If imposing tariffs and protective barriers made nations poor, then every country on earth would be racing to eliminate these policies, and China would be the first on line. They run a very strong country, but they're not first in line, and the American people are paying a very big price. From 1789 to 1913, we were a tariff-backed nation, and the United States was proportionately the wealthiest it has ever been. So wealthy, in fact, that in the 1880s, they established a commission to decide what they were going to do with the vast sums of money they were collecting. We were collecting so much money so fast, we didn't know what to do with it. Isn't that a nice problem to have? What do you think, Marco? Good problem? Marco would love that problem. But we don't have that problem anymore, but we're not going to have it very much longer, I will tell you. But they collected so much money, they actually formed a commission to determine what they were going to do with the money, who they were going to give it to, and how much. Then in 1913, for reasons unknown to mankind, they established the income tax so that citizens, rather than foreign countries, would start paying the money necessary to run our government. Then in 1929, it all came to a very abrupt end with the Great Depression, and it would have never happened if they had stayed with the tariff policy. It would have been a much different story. They tried to bring back tariffs to save our country, but it was gone. It was gone. It was too late. Nothing could have been done. It took years and years to get out of that depression, far longer than even FDR had that office right over there for a long period of time. The ramp system, that's rather intricate, was built because of him, and every time you walk up, you think of him, and he did a great job in many ways, but it lasted long beyond his terms, as you know. But it's not too late any longer, and we're going to start being smart, and we're going to start being very wealthy again. We're going to be wealthy as a country because they've taken so much of our wealth away from us. We're not going to let that happen. We truly can be very wealthy. We can be so much wealthier than any country. It's not even believable, but we're getting smart. Nearly a century later, in the face of unrelenting economic warfare, the United States can no longer continue with a policy of unilateral economic surrender. We cannot pay the deficits of Canada, Mexico, and so many other countries. We used to do it. We can't do it anymore. We take care of countries all over the world. We pay for their military. We pay for everything they have to pay, and then when you want to cut back a little bit, they get upset that you're not taking care of them any longer. But we have to take care of our people, and we're going to take care of our people first, and I'm sorry to say that. And today we're standing up for the American worker, and we are finally putting America first. In Sleepy Joe Biden's last year in office, the United States hemorrhaged 100,000 manufacturing jobs, and the number was going through the roof at levels never seen before. And our trade deficit reached a record $1.2 trillion, which is unheard of. Since the beginning of NAFTA, the worst trade deal ever made, it was a horror show. We I was able to terminate it. They all said you'd never be able to get it out. We had to get approval from Congress to get it terminated. We had to live with that deal. It was the worst trade deal ever made by far. But since the very beginning of NAFTA, our country lost 90,000 factories. Think of what that is, 90,000. Think about putting a map up and putting tax on it. You wouldn't have enough room. 90,000. I said, is that possible? We had it checked 4 different times, and it was actually somewhat higher than that. And 5 million manufacturing jobs were lost while racking up trade deficits of $19 trillion. That was the worst trade deal ever made. As a result of these gigantic losses, foreign nations now own $26 trillion more of American assets than think of this, than the Americans own of their own foreign assets or other foreign assets. The United States can no longer produce enough antibiotics to treat our sick. We have a tremendous problem. We have to go to foreign countries to treat our sick. If anything ever happened from a war standpoint, we wouldn't be able to do it. We import virtually all of our computers, phones, televisions, and electronics. We used to dominate the field, and now we import it all from different countries. A single shipyard in China now produces more ships every year than all of the American shipyards combined. Think of that. And it was a business that we used to dominate. We used to dominate it totally. In short, chronic trade deficits are no longer merely an economic problem. They're a national emergency that threatens our security and our very way of life. It's a very great threat to our country. And for these reasons, starting tomorrow, the United States will implement reciprocal tariffs on other nations. It's been a long time since we even thought of that. We used to think about it a lot. We didn't think about it for many decades, and you see what's happened. For nations that treat us badly, we will calculate the combined rate of all their tariffs, non-monetary barriers, and other forms of cheating. And because we are being very kind, we're kind people, very kind. You're not so kind when you got ripped off with your salaries. My auto worker friends and my Teamster friends and all of the unions that typically voted Democrat, they're not voting Democrat anymore because worker, whether union or non-worker, they're for the Republicans now. That's what happened. But we will charge them approximately half of what they are and have been charging us. So the tariffs will be not a full reciprocal. I could have done that, yes, but it would have been tough for a lot of countries who didn't want to do that. I'd like to see the chart if you have it. Could you bring it up, Howard? This is our great Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick. Thanks, Howard. So if you look at that, China, first row, China, 67%. That's tariffs charged to the USA, including currency manipulation and trade barriers. So 67%, I think you can, for the most part, see it. Those with good eyes, with bad eyes. We didn't want to bring, it's very windy out here. We didn't want to bring out the big charts because it had no chance of standing. Fortunately, we came armed with a little smaller chart. So it's 67%, so we're going to be charging a discounted reciprocal tariff of 34%. I think, in other words, they charge us, we charge them less. So how can anybody be upset? They will be because we never charge anybody anything, but now we're going to charge. European Union, they're very tough, very, very tough traders. You know, you think of European Union, very friendly. They rip us off. It's so sad to see. It's so pathetic. 39%, we're going to charge them 20%, so we're charging them essentially half. Vietnam, great negotiators, great people. They like me, I like them. The problem is they charge us 90%. We're going to charge them 46% tariff. Taiwan, where they took all of our computer chips and semiconductors. We used to be the king, right? We were everything. We had all of it. Now we have almost none of it, except the biggest company is coming in. We're going to end up with almost 40%. Lee Zeldin's working to get their approvals. And it's an amazing company. Mr. Wei, of one of the great companies of the world, actually. They're coming in from Taiwan, and they're going to build one of the biggest plants in the world, maybe the biggest for that. But 64%, we're going to charge them 32%. Japan, very, very tough. Great people. And again, I don't blame the people for doing it. I think they're very smart in doing it. I blame the people that sat right in that Oval Office, right over there, right behind the Resolute desk or whichever desk they chose. Japan, 46%. They would charge us 46%, and much higher for certain items like cars, little items like cars. 46%, we're charging them 24%. India, very, very tough, very, very tough. The Prime Minister just left, and he's a great friend of mine, but I said, you're a friend of mine, but you're not treating us right. They charge us 52%. You have to understand, we charge them almost nothing for years and years and decades, and it was only 7 years ago when I came in, we started with China and charged them. We took in hundreds of billions of dollars from China in tariffs, and they understood, honestly. President Xi understood. He said, look, I understand, and the other countries, and they all understand. We're going to have to go through a little tough love, maybe, but they all understand. They're ripping us off, and they understood it. Prime Minister of Japan, Shinzo Abe. He was a fantastic man. He was unfortunately taken from us, assassination. But I went to him and I said, Shinzo, we have to do something. A trade is not fair. And he said, I know that, I know that. And he was a great gentleman. He was a fantastic man, but he understood immediately what I was talking about. I said, Shinzo, we have to do something. He said, I know that. And we worked out a deal, and it would have been a much better deal, but frankly, there were many years left on the deal that was made previous to my getting there, but it was something. If you look at Switzerland, 61% to 31%, Indonesia, Malaysia, Cambodia, oh, look at Cambodia, 97%. We're going to bring it down to 49. They made a fortune with the United States of America. United Kingdom, 10%, and we'll go 10%. So we'll do the same thing. South Africa, 60%, 30%, and they've got some bad things going on in South Africa. We're paying them billions of dollars, and we cut the funding because a lot of bad things are happening in South Africa. The fake news ought to be looking at it. They don't want to report it. Brazil, 10%, 10%. Bangladesh is 74%. So you see what's going on. Pakistan, 58%. Sri Lanka, 88%. So what we're doing is we're taking not the full, we could take the full 88%. Thanks a lot, Harold. He's doing a very good job. How's he doing, all right? I think you better take it with you. It's not going to last very long. He's going to put it, it's going to follow you down with the wind. I brought a hat just in case it got too windy, but here, would anybody like a hat? I'm not giving it to a cabinet. I'm giving it to the auto workers. Come here. Thank you, fellas. Get it. That's it. That's it. They deserve it more than our cabinet. Our cabinet has plenty of hats. But you see the numbers. The numbers are so disproportionate. They're so unfair. At the same time, we will establish a minimum baseline tariff of 10%. You notice that on the chart. And that'll be on other countries to help rebuild our economy and to prevent cheating. So we're going to have a minimum of cheating, and we're going to be very severe on the people that at the gate that watch the tariffs and watch the product coming in, because there's been a lot of bad things happening at the gate because the money is so enormous that you're talking about. There's never been probably anything like it in terms of the enormity, and there are a lot of bad things happen at the people that do the check-in, and they're looking at 10-year jail sentences if they do play. We're going to treat them so good, but if they cheat, the repercussions are going to be extremely strong. Foreign nations will finally be asked to pay for the privilege of access to our market, the biggest market in the world. We're right now the biggest market in the world. We had a great country 4 years ago in terms of the economics. We were doubling up on China. We were doing so well. Nobody was going to catch us, but so much of it slipped away over the last 4 years under Biden. I campaigned on this policy throughout last year, and today that promise was made, and it was also a promise, as you know, that was kept. Promises made, promises kept. To any company that objects to our common sense reciprocal tariffs, again, reciprocal, back and forth, and I call this kind reciprocal. This is not full reciprocal. This is kind reciprocal. But what we do is we cut it in half. We charge them. My answer is very simple. If they complain, if you want your tariff rate to be zero, then you build your product right here in America, because there is no tariff if you build your plant, your product in America. And we've seen companies coming in like we've never seen before. Likewise to all of the foreign presidents, prime ministers, kings, queens, ambassadors, and everyone else who will soon be calling to ask for exemptions from these tariffs. I say, terminate your own tariffs, drop your barriers, don't manipulate your currencies. They manipulate their currencies like nobody can even believe, which is a bad, bad thing and very devastating to us. And start buying tens of billions of dollars of American goods. Tariffs give our country protection against those that would do us economic harm. And many people were looking to do us economic harm. Maybe not so obviously, but they were doing tremendous economic harm. But even more importantly, they will give us growth. These tariffs are going to give us growth like you haven't seen before. And it'll be something very special to watch. I am so looking forward. And Brian, it's going to happen even faster than you said. You know, you might say, but it's already started. It's already started. Work's already begun on plants all around the country. And you see that as before. These are big, rich companies. We have $61 billion started on a big plant going up. It's going to be announced over the next 2 days, and they already started work. Many of these the biggest companies in the world, they've committed to build, build, build. We're going to build, 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 sir. And they came here to see me, and they wanted to know if they could have a press conference. I do as many as I can. I'm pretty busy trying to stop Russia and Ukraine and the Middle East. We got to stop that. We got to stop the Houthis, which we're making tremendous. They like shooting ships down and out of the water, sinking ships. They get a kick out of it, but they're not getting such a kick out of it now, are they, Mr. Secretary? They're not getting such a kick out of that now. But here are just a short list of some of the companies that have already announced and committed to investment. And this is a company that built its factories and its plants in China. Apple is going to spend $500 billion. They never spent money like that here. They're going to build their plants here. SoftBank, OpenAI, and Oracle, great companies, are investing $500 billion almost immediately. NVIDIA, a hot company, is investing hundreds of billions of dollars. They just announced. TSMC, the biggest, most important company in the world of chips from Taiwan, with no investment from us, is investing $200 billion. And they said the reason was, number one, the election of November 5th, and number two, the tariffs. They don't want to pay the tariffs, and the way they're not paying it is to build their plant here. So we're going to go from almost no percentage. We used to have 100% of the chip market. Now it's all in Taiwan. Almost all of it's in Taiwan, a couple of other countries, but mostly in Taiwan. And think of it, we had 100%. We lost it because of people in that office that didn't do their job. They allowed it to be stolen from us. Johnson & Johnson, great company, $55 billion. Eli Lilly, $27 billion. Meta is investing $500 billion. Wow. DeMac is investing $20 billion. CMA, CGM, $20 billion. And then you have Merck and Clarios, Stellantis, General Motors, GE Aerospace, Honda, Nissan, Hyundai are all putting in billions and billions of dollars, and they're committed 100%. So. And we've never had, and this is after 2.5 months. This is after just a short, this all took place as soon as we came out with what everybody wanted to do. You know, I watched a gentleman today on television, used to work with Lee Iacocca, a very respected automobile person, and he said, you know, because they're asking people, and they try and get as many negative people as they can, but they can't find them too much. It's pretty hard to find in terms of what we're doing, especially when they see all this investment. They said, so tell me, what do you think of what Trump is doing from the automobile standpoint? He said, I can't believe it. Somebody is finally, he's an older guy, real pro, really top guy, with Lee Iacocca. He said, I never thought I'd see the day when this would happen. where somebody had the courage to go and do what has to be done. This is transforming our nation. Our entire nation is going to be transformed, not only with the cars, but on every single other item that's built. We're going to become an industrial powerhouse. And he said that so beautifully today. In fact, I'm going to find out, I'm going to get a tape. And Bruce, I'm going to get that tape and I'm going to send it to you out in Long Island, and you're going to play it for the people and all your union workers and your non-union workers out there. You got a pretty even split. But we have, so far, it looks like we're going to have about $6 trillion of investments, and you wouldn't do that in years in this country over the last number of years. $6 trillion, and that's going to be much higher by the end of the year. And think of what $6 trillion is. You wouldn't have even a small percentage of that under this other system. We're going to be an entirely different country, and it's going to be fantastic for the workers. It's going to be fantastic for everyone. There will never have been a transformation of a country like the transformation that's already happening in the United States of America. It's an incredible thing to watch, and it's incredible to meet with the top people, people that you read about, very wealthy people, or people that are great managers and executives and presidents of big public companies, and to watch the enthusiasm they have now that they didn't have. They gave up on our country. They went to foreign countries and they built. Companies are pouring into our country at levels never seen before, with jobs and money to follow, and it's really beautiful. In the coming days, there will be complaints from the globalists and the outsourcers and special interests and the fake news. Always, fake news will always complain. But never forget, every prediction our opponents made about trade for the last 30 years has been proven totally wrong. They were wrong about NAFTA. They were wrong about China. They were wrong about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have been a disaster if I didn't terminate it. If I didn't terminate that, United Auto Workers, you would have had no jobs in this country. You would have had no jobs. It was all going to other countries. In my first term, they said tariffs would crash the economy. Instead, we built the greatest economy in the history of the world. And again, I have great respect for President Xi of China, great respect for China, but they were taking tremendous advantage of us, and I commend them for that. I say, hey, if you can get away with it, that's okay. But, you know, they understand exactly what's happening, and they probably, most of them are saying it's about time they did something, but, and they're going to fight, and they're going to fight fair. Everyone's going to fight. You know, it's like, I say to the leaders, look, you got to take care of your country, but we have to start taking care of our country now. We can't do what we've been doing for the last 50 years. From the day of my election, the stock market went up in my first term 88%, with NASDAQ going up 155%, more than any president has ever had in any term in office, by far. And I think we're going to blow that away. And maybe the numbers won't show, but I think they're going to show much better than even those numbers. But what you're going to see is you're going to see activity, that empty, dead sites, factories that are falling down. Those factories will be knocked down, and they're going to have brand new factories built in their place. They're not only talking about renovating, they're talking about brand new, the best anywhere in the world, the biggest anywhere in the world. I have a friend who builds car plants, and I said, I want to see the biggest and the best. He said, well, we have to go to Mexico. I said, no, I want to see it in the United States. He said, we're not building them in there. This is a year and a half ago during the campaign. He said, we're not building it. You'd have to go to Mexico. When I was starting to decide to run, and I went to #1 in the polls very rapidly, I want to say, like, let's say in the first hour. And then shortly thereafter, it looked like I was going to win, and the fake news was saying, oh, no, don't do this. What they don't know is if I didn't win, they would have really been in trouble, because nobody wants to read them anyway. But I tell you what, when it looked like I was going to win, I announced that I was going to be doing exactly what we're talking about today. Great consistency, actually, because I've been talking about it for 40 years. But because I saw what was happening 40 years ago. If you look at my old speeches when I was young, very handsome, my old speeches, and that people would say, I'd be on a television show, I'd be talking about how we were being ripped off by these countries. I mean, nothing changes very much. The only thing that changed were the countries, but nothing really changes. But you know, it's why it's such an honor. It's such an honor to be finally able to do this. If you look at China, I took in hundreds of billions of dollars in my term, hundreds of billions. They never paid 10 cents to any other president, and yet they paid hundreds of billions, so much so that Biden couldn't do anything. They wanted to try and terminate it because he had a very special relationship with China. You know what the relationship was? He had a special relationship. But the numbers were so big, that they couldn't do it.
You know what? So why don't we just stop here? Donald Trump is going to keep talking, but I think for the moment, Canada may have heard what it needed to hear. That was the Rose Garden. It still is the Rose Garden event for what Donald Trump calls one of the most important days in American history. It's Declaration of Economic Independence, if you will. He took aim at tariffs, at non-monetary barriers, which he said were sometimes worse than the monetary ones. And he said that effective at midnight, there will be a 25% tariff on all foreign-made automobiles. How that is defined will be in the fine print. He talked of how Canada imposes a 250 to 300% tariff on dairy products. He said, we don't like it. He said, with countries like Canada, we subsidize a lot of them, close to $200 billion a year, which has been said again and again. It is not true. It's not true in the dollar figure. It's not true in the characterization of a subsidy. He continued to say we can't pay the deficits of Canada anymore. Again, that is not something that has happened. He said NAFTA, interestingly, was the worst trade deal that ever happened. He offered lots of numbers in there, lots of fact-checking required for that. He said deficits are not an economic problem, but a matter of national security. At one point, he brought out a prop. It was a chart. He listed off all of the countries. Our producers have been grabbing a photograph of that chart. As soon as we get it, we will show it to you. But interestingly, on the chart that had like Canada, Taiwan, India, Sri Lanka, China, Taiwan, India, Sri Lanka did not mention Canada by name. We've looked at the chart. Canada is not on it. So what is happening with this country? Well, it may be the case that Canada falls into the category of what he referred to as 10% sweeping tariffs. But as we've been saying all along, never mind what he says. It will be the wording in the executive orders that will tell the accurate story. If you were looking at that Rose Garden event, you will notice that there is a little table beside the podium, and on the table are a series of binders, a few Sharpies. So the anticipation is that there will be an executive order or several of them signed in front of that crowd. So as we talk, and he's still at the podium, our producers are listening. If he says something that is germane to Canada, we'll pop back in there. But in the interim, let's break away from that and break this down with our chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton, Power and Politics host David Cochran. So, Rosie, your immediate gut reaction to what you just heard?
I mean, I think what Canada can take away, and will, of course, as you said, wait for confirmation in the executive order, is that we probably fall under the category of a 10% universal reciprocal tariff. That is still devastating for Canada. We are going from having no tariffs under a free trade agreement that has been in existence for decades now to having a 10% tariffs on all Canadian exports. Again, we'll see whether there are carve-outs and exemptions, but in the little bit of information that the president has presented there, that is at least how I interpret it. I mean, good that we're not on the chart, I guess. Good that the amount is not more than 10% potentially. And I should say that Katie and I are both working our sources to see if we can get confirmation from the Canadian government on that 10%. But, you know, the Canadian government was watching that just like everybody else, because that's how the White House does these things, even though there were conversations even as recently as yesterday and today with the Commerce Secretary. I would say one other thing. The fact that, and then I'll let David say things, the fact that he singled out the supply management issue in Canada, I think should be worrying for Canada. This was, in the renegotiation of CUSMA in the first edition of Trump, an irritant right until the very end. It was the last thing they talked about, and it was the thing that got dealt with last. as recently as today, the Prime Minister has said supply management is not on the table. But some of the things that Donald Trump was asserting there are fiction. Yes, there you can get to tariffs of 250%, but in fact, that doesn't happen because there are quotas in terms of how much the United States can sell to Canada, and the U.S. has not exceeded those quotas. So they never get tariffed that high. That is simply not something that is true. It is possible, but it has not happened. And I would point out that Canada is still the second highest importer of U.S. dairy products. So this is an issue. Listen, supply management is an ongoing irritant for multiple countries with Canada, an ongoing complaint. But the way it is being presented here by the president is not accurate. But it is, I think, an indication that there are issues that he has with Canada. And if he's singling that one out, I think that we need to pay attention to that.
Rosie, just while we've been talking to the chart, we do actually have the picture. Now, I just want to show folks that we're not making it up that Canada wasn't on the chart. So if we're able to bring that up from the control room, that would be great. There you go. Okay. Not the best picture. And unfortunately, the bar at the bottom, the breaking news bar, you're going to have to take my word for it, that the countries under the breaking news bar there, Canada's not one of them. So that is the prop, the chart that he held up. Canada is not on it. It only matters if Canada's on the executive order. So David Cochran, I know you got lots to say. What are you thinking?
Yeah, there are 50 countries on that chart who are hit with various levels of tariffs. They all seem to be about 50 cents on the dollar to a minimum of 10% of what they think is being done unfairly to the United States. Canada and Mexico are not part of this, which is relevant that Mexico is also not on that chart because of the North American Trade Pact that we have. And it does seem from the people I'm talking to, the belief, there's no confirmation, is that Canada falls into that 10% baseline tariff. Now, is that universal? Are there carve-outs for CUSMA-compliant sectors? Does this stack on top of steel and aluminum? Does this stack on top of auto tariffs? Does this stack on top of the earlier tariffs that they outlined, to deal with fentanyl, allegedly, and border migrations? It is remarkable, Adrian, that the world is learning what's happening to their economies from a prop chart being held up and read from in the Rose Garden by the President of the United States, like he's trying to sell you a timeshare in Florida. The ripple effects of this are astronomical. It is a list of grievances spelled out in percentages, and Donald Trump is essentially making it clear to countries that he wants you to be a market or a supplier of goods. He sure doesn't want you to be a competitor, doesn't even really want you to be a partner in some cases, and that this is, his vision of what needs to happen, not to rebalance trade, but so the U.S. kind of dominates trade. And this is an interesting reality to look at, from their biggest trading partner, their biggest market, and the most exposed economy to the whims of Donald Trump on the face of the earth. So while we were not on that chart as a country, they're very much in the blast radius of what he's doing there. And even at the low end of 10%, Mark Carney said the other day, their impression was they're getting the best of a bad deal. It's still a pretty bad deal.
No kidding. And listen, as you see him talking, the president talking on the side of the screen there, it's pretty wide speech. Right now, he's been talking about Medicaid, so we've sort of veered off tariffs for the moment. But Rosie, just before the U.S. president spoke, I gather the Prime Minister put out a statement about supply management. What did he say?
This was before the president mentioned it, but he did again reiterate his position that Canada's supply management is not on the negotiating table. And listen, that is the position of every Canadian politician, with the exception of, I think, Maxime Bernier, who's the head of the People's Party of Canada. And putting supply management on the table would mean the end of support in Quebec, to say the least, and probably Ontario as well, for any politician that did that. So there are political reasons for doing that as well. But it is also obviously a system that Canadian politicians believe works well for Canadian consumers and Canadian farmers, for that matter. I will just go back to the comment that the president made about NAFTA. it's not clear to me whether he's talking about the original NAFTA, but a good reminder that it was this president that renegotiated CUSMA and was happy with the deal that he walked away with when he was first president in his first term. So to now be deriding a deal as abusive and damaging to the American economy is quite extraordinary. And quite something, because he had many hands to play in those negotiations, and he walked away saying that the United States had come out ahead. So whether he's talking about the original or where it is now, I think that's also a point we need to reflect on, because clearly, if we get to a renegotiation of this deal after an election, as the Prime Minister and the President have agreed to, whether it's a different Prime Minister or not, or whether we wait until 2026 when the legal review must happen, I think that we should be prepared for that to be very, very difficult. Most politicians believe in this country, most officials believe in this country that CUSMA is dead, that there is no free trade agreement. And certainly if there's a 10% across the board tariff on Canadian exports, that is accurate. The free trade deal does no longer exist.
If you're going to pull
I got to jump in there for a second, Adrian, because just to add to the confusion, okay? CNN is reporting that Trump's policy will put in place a baseline 10% tariff on all goods from all countries except those compliant with the USMCA free trade agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Non-compliant goods will continue to be charged at a 25% rate. Importers of goods from other nations will begin paying the baseline 10% tariff on Saturday at 12:01 a.m. Eastern Time. So CNN is reporting that there appears to be an exemption for the USMCA free trade agreement partners, provided the goods are in compliance. Now, as we learned with the tariffs that were put in place a while ago, not every company that sends goods into the United States is compliant, because sometimes the rules of origin are too complicated and too expensive to bother with. So they just pay the low baseline tariff and take the hit that way. This, though, seems to suggest, based on the reporting from CNN, that there is some sort of an exemption here. Again, we need to see the executive orders, but this is, again, the chaos of the president's approach to trade.
And imagine running a small business right now and trying to figure out what you deliver, what orders you take. In addition, because Sarah in the control room has been listening, we haven't missed anything. He's talked about how pharma companies will come roaring back. Again, talked more about Medicaid. I did want to say, Rosie, when you were asking which free trade agreement is he talking about, if we pull out his timeline, first he said it was being ripped off for the last 50 years, and then he went at the last 30 years. So
right.
Could be the OG NAFTA, not entirely sure. So as you see the U.S. president, he appears to be heading out of the Rose Garden, unless he's
headed the sign, I think, is what's going to happen now. He moves away, and an aide brings him the executive orders, holds them open, explains out loud. Typically, this is because we've done many of these over the last little while. Explains what's in it, and then the Sharpie comes out and the big signature goes on.
Right. I'll just say, Adrian, we are obviously working sources, both Katie and David and I, to find out who has understood where Canada falls in this. Again, this confusion is to be expected and is normal from the president. But if there is on some planet that Canada has escaped entirely a tariff, the politics of that in this moment, in the beginning of an election campaign, are enormous. We know that phone call between the president and the prime minister went well. We know that after that phone call, Donald Trump no longer referred to the prime minister as governor, as he did with Justin Trudeau. And he certainly stopped his talk about the 51st state. If somehow we have been spared from this, the politics of that will be monumental in this election campaign. Of course, that's the part that we are trying to confirm.
Okay. Again, I appreciate all the references to trying to, waiting to listen, waiting to hear what's there. I know that's what everyone is doing. Why don't we take
Adrian,
a moment?
there's actually a longer list, if I can just jump in, a much, much, much longer list than the sort of the prop list with the first 50 names.
Oh, good.
It gets into much smaller countries. Still no Canada, still no Mexico that I can see. But just to give you an example of how exhaustive this is, Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, the French islands off the southern coast of my home province, across from the Burin Peninsula, the area where my mother was born and raised, they are being hit with a 50% tariff from the United States. this is a very small French colony, you know, overseas, just off the coast of southern Newfoundland. But the Turks and Caicos, Aruba, Montenegro, Gibraltar is being tariffed by the U.S. president, Barbados, Zimbabwe, Afghanistan, you know, Malawi. It just goes on and on and on and on. But there is no Canada and there is no Mexico on either the short list that we saw him holding up as he did this, or on the longer list that has been circulated amongst reporters there.
I would imagine Afghanistan. I would imagine people in Barbados and are saying, "I'm sorry, what?" So yeah, lots more to learn here. Rosie and David, thank you very much. I know you've got Power and Politics coming up very shortly, David, and we'll be listening to you there. So thanks for that.
So also, Adrian, we have a senior White House official. Exemption for USMCA compliant goods from Mexico and Canada will continue. So
what does that mean?
We've been liberated on Liberation Day. I have no idea exactly what that means, but it sounds like the 10% tariff will not apply to any exports from Canada and Mexico into the United States if they are compliant with the standards of CUSMA. So we need to hear from the federal government here exactly if this is their understanding.
Sure.
The pattern has always been they do not say anything until they can read everything, right? You don't go off what a White House official says. You don't go off what the president says. You need to see the actual orders themselves. But if truly there is an exemption for Canada and Mexico, that changes the understanding of things today quite dramatically, and it points to the, I think it underscores the importance of the conversation that Mark Carney and Donald Trump had on Friday when they agreed that there would be a conversation that begins after this election on the larger conversation, the renegotiation of the trade, security, and defense relationship between the two countries, something Pierre Poilievre also talked about today at his speech today, saying that he would offer, should he win this election, become prime minister, to start an urgent renegotiation. But it seems like at this point, based on this is an alert coming across our wires, that Liberation Day does not include the USMCA partners, at least not as a direct hit if they're compliant with the conditions of the trade agreement. Again, this is our understanding right now at just before 5 p.m. Eastern Time. That could be very different at 5:01 Eastern Time, but this is what the alerts are telling us right now.
This is exhausting for Canadians.
Sure is. Sure is. Imagine, Adrian, your job, your house, your retirement, your kids' education, whether you can stay in that town, whether you have to move, all of that depends on certainty right now in the most uncertain economic time. And to underscore the fact that this is not driven by global events, this is all happening by choice. This is, if it's a recession of choice and by design based on the trade policy of the President of the United States.
It creates instability for sure, and is not and is upsetting for the Canadians that have had to live through this now for months on end. But let's be clear, if we are exempt entirely from a tariff, that is a significant win for the country. That means that we, in order to become CUSMA compliant, NAFTA compliant, it is essentially paperwork that must be done, and businesses haven't always done that paperwork. It may also mean that they have to find American or Canadian parts for a good that they are exporting to the United States, but there are ways to be compliant. Most people believe that we can get to about 90% of goods exported to hit compliance. That means that the trade deal is not what it was, but that there is a breath of air, at least, left in it. And it indicates as well that if there is going to be a broader renegotiation of this deal after, that there are some things that we can work on and work towards. A 10% tariff would have been devastating on multiple sectors, it does seem as though this is fairly good news. Again, if this is happening in the midst of an election campaign where Canada is now exempt from a tariff, and you have a Liberal leader, aka the Prime Minister, who has managed to negotiate this, the ramifications of that will echo very loudly through this campaign.
And I think on a personal level for Canadians too, who will be waiting to find out if it's true. I'm not convinced that you will see those elbows come down, right? There has been a wound that is going to take a long time to heal.
Yeah, and indeed, Mark Carney has talked about the lost trust, the broken trust between Canada and the United States. And let's be clear, I would imagine the 25% on steel and aluminum remains. I would imagine that part of the auto sector is still going to be hit by tariffs starting tomorrow. So it is not as though we are spared from everything. Right. But the damage is certainly potentially much lesser than what we expected, and that what other countries are going to have to deal with immediately.
Just a little bit more clarity, Adrian. A senior White House official says USMCA compliant goods will continue to receive exemption from the fentanyl-related tariffs. So none of the tariffs announced today apply to Canada, apply to Mexico. The pause button that was pressed on the global sort of tariffs, that continues to be paused. The steel and aluminum and the auto part ones that are going to come in at midnight tonight, those will still come into effect and have an impact on Canada. Though, as we learned when those were announced, there will be a sliding scale as they do sort of this tariff-related vivisection of a North American automobile to see how much is U.S. Parts versus Canadian parts, and then the tariff will be on a sliding scale based on that. Now, the practicality of that is a mystery to me, like many of the things that are happening in this. But essentially, this buildup and this anxiety leading to this day affects everybody else except Canada and Mexico, is the conclusion you can draw from this. Because for whatever reason, whether it was the phone call last week, whether it was the trillions and trillions of dollars in lost wealth on the U.S. stock market since Donald Trump has started talking about tariffs, whether it is the pressure from Republicans and Democrats at the Senate, House, and governor level in all the states that are affected by this, the big three automakers going to the White House, the chambers of commerce, whether it's all of that, he's punted on essentially a stated policy goal. It still hangs out there, and it still affects those very specific sectors. Yep. But the global disruption to our trading relationship, at least, is yet again in some form of abeyance until it's not. Right. But here's where we are right now.
Okay. It also means, Adrian, that the counter tariffs won't go ahead, presumably. Yeah. If this is happening, then it means that the government does not need to put further counter tariffs on the United States, which ultimately also helps Canadians, right? Because it means that the cost of goods coming from the United States will not go up in the immediate either.
Not to be distrustful, but I'm going to put a big asterisk beside all of this, because let's wait to see what the paperwork actually says. But I hear everything you're saying. This could be absolutely huge.
There's a tariff on the asterisk, though, Adrian. Just remember that.
Of course. Could we just flip over back to the Rose Garden for a second? Because Katie Simpson has got her hands on something there. Katie Simpson, what have you got?
Adrian, so as that event was taking place, staff members from the White House went around to all the reporters and handed out the reciprocal tariff list. So I know that the president was holding up a giant chart on TV. Well, that giant chart is actually 8 pages of countries, I believe more than 60 of them listed here. And as soon as they were handed out to reporters, I was standing next to the reporter from the Canadian press, and we were just going flipping, making sure our eyes weren't deceiving us. But when neither Canada nor Mexico were mentioned in this, that was, a sign that perhaps this is not going to apply in the same way that it is applying to other countries. But again, as you mentioned, Adrian, some of the American reporting is suggesting that USMCA compliant countries might not face that 10% tariff. Again, we're waiting to get our hands on some of those details. I have been urgently emailing with the White House to see if they're willing to offer us any clarity at this time, to offer any new specifics, just to sort of firm up what we're hearing from American U.S. news outlets. But at this point, they're not getting back to us just yet. But Adrian, certainly one other thing that I noticed and stood out to me in this event today is, Donald Trump a number of times did name check Canada, even though Canada is not mentioned, in the papers. And he did have a bit of a different tone, even though he was critical of protections for Canada's dairies industry, which, by the way, he agreed to under the new USMCA. He negotiated that and agreed to that. But as he criticized Canada and talked about his familiar irritants, he talked about Canada saying, we can't keep supporting them. You've got to go on your own. It's sort of a change, because when Donald Trump airs that grievance, when he goes after that line of attack, he often tacks onto that. That's why they should become the 51st state. He didn't do that today. So that is something that stood out to me as different, Adrian.
Katie, and just an indication of how much this matters to markets and how many people are watching. The Canadian dollar is up It is up, I think, half a percentage point. Is that right? I don't see it precisely. I don't know the precise dollar figure, but Canadian dollar is up on just the promise that it's possible that Canada has maybe escaped this next round. What is the feeling? You were in the Rose Garden. I know you're close to Pebble Beach now, but you were in the Rose Garden. What was the feeling there, Katie?
It was truly a celebration for the Trump administration. They brought in most members of cabinet. You could see the people who were heavily involved in these negotiations really smiling, joking, hugging one another as they were waiting for President Trump to arrive. And in the audience today, they had a number of workers whose industries are affected by this. Lots of people in construction vests, in hard hats, cheering pretty hard for the president, especially when some of those tariffs related to the auto sector were announced. So that it was seen as a celebration among those in the Trump administration and the guests that were invited there. You saw some of the hardline Trump supporters, Speaker Mike Johnson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, the Republican Congresswoman, and so really from the Trump administration's perspective, they see this as a big win for them.
Okay, all right, Katie Simpson at the White House, close to the West Wing. In case you're wondering what I meant by Pebble Beach, that's what we referred to as the spot where the reporters put all their cameras. It used to be that you'd put your cameras there and the tripods would sink into the grass. So they, various administrations ago, put a whole bunch of pebbles down so they don't sink. That's why we call it Pebble Beach. All right, so that was Katie Simpson. I'd like to bring in Mahmoud Nanji now. Is policy fellow at the Ivey Business School at Western University, also served as Associate Deputy Minister at the Ontario Ministry of Finance. So Mahmoud, good to have you with us in this moment. I mean, like us, I know you're anxious to read that executive order, but with Canada not on the prop list, as it were, your sense this country still is in the crosshairs?
Adrian, thanks for having me. I think we should be cautiously optimistic about this, and there still is a big risk here. I know that look, it's been a dizzying, exhausting, a stunning day in many ways, and scary for businesses and workers in this country. It may have been Liberation Day and Declaration of Economic Independence Day for the president, but I think the world will see this as a declaration of a trade war on the world. And basically what Donald Trump has said is that, look, if you want to do business in the U.S., the world's most successful economy, then you're going to have to pay a market access fee. And the issue is what the consequences of this is going to be. You will know that he conveniently did not talk about what pain this will have on the American economy. Previously had talked a little bit about maybe some pressure and some costs going up and perhaps an adjustment period. He spoke none of that today. And I think that's a bit delusional on his part, because I think there's going to be some fairly significant consequences. The other thing is that with all of these different rates and stuff like that, this is going to be an administrative nightmare to actually put into place. And businesses already have enough things to worry about. They're anxious about enough things that now they don't even know whether this applies, doesn't apply. So, my assessment of this is, Adrian, is that we can't be overly optimistic. Even if we were spared by some of the announcements today, there are still the other tariffs that will go into effect. And remember, that negotiation that's supposed to happen after the election won't be an easy one.
I think we've all seen it before. Donald Trump imposes tariffs, yet he doesn't want to hurt American businesses. Is it your sense that he can actually have it both ways?
Well, he can't. The thing is that he says he wants to impose tariffs because it's going to repatriate jobs. He talked about all those investments coming in here. And he's said that, there won't be much inflation. The bottom line is that he can't have both, right? He can't have, these tariffs and then have no impact on the economy. These tariffs will have an impact on the U.S. economy. And there will be job loss. We saw that the last time he had imposed tariffs. This will cause more business uncertainty. And as you rightly pointed out, so today he says something, 2 days from now, he changes his mind. And I guess we'll have to see in the coming days how the markets respond. We'll have to see how other economies respond to this. Because if the other economies start responding and escalate this trade war, we're headed for a global recession and perhaps a period of stagflation.
But what if other economies respond the way he suggests some have? by, a country like Israel, like removing tariffs, or other companies pulling up sticks and moving to the United States wholesale, which is what he maintains is the ultimate objective, to bring the business and the manufacturing and the factories back to the U.S. What if that starts happening?
So I think, look, we can expect that there will be some shifting of investment. There'll be some shifting of manufacturing, but it won't be to the magnitude that he thinks is going to happen. Not to the level where he thinks he can generate almost $2 trillion of tariff revenue to pay for either the deficit or for his tax cuts. And even if he repatriates these things, where there might be job gains in one area, there may not be job gains in the other areas. So will some countries adjust their behavior? And look, he's talking about leveling the playing field, and I understand that, and that makes a lot of economic sense, especially when countries were charging exorbitant rates. But I think many of the other countries are going to take a really tough stand. I think you can expect the EU to do that. And, I don't think Japan's all of a sudden going to open up their economy and say, bring in all of the American vehicles. And by the way, even if you brought in all those American vehicles, I'm not quite sure the Japanese would necessarily buy the American vehicles.
Okay, fair enough. In other words, watch this space. So much more to come. Canada's economy, its resilience, regardless of what happens with the tariffs, is clearly going to be a focus for a whole bunch of people at this point. Mahmoud Nanji of the Ivey Business School at Western University, thank you for that.
Thanks for having me.
So while we can, let's take a live look at Parliament Hill in Ottawa. The Cabinet Committee on Canada-U.S. Relations is about to meet to plan how Canada will respond to the tariffs just announced by U.S. President Donald Trump. Everyone, of course, is still waiting for the fine print. The CBC's David Cochrane will have more on that, more reaction when he hosts Power and Politics, which is coming up next on CBC News Network. I'm Adrienne Arsenault. Thank you for watching.
For decades, our country has been looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by nations near and far, both friend and foe alike. Our country and its taxpayers have been ripped off for more than 50 years, but it is not going to happen anymore. It's not going to happen.
U.S. President Donald Trump calls it America's Liberation Day, the beginning of the Golden Age, the policy that will make America wealthy again. In reality, it's Detonation Day for global trade norms established over many decades, but Canada and Mexico may be spared, at least in part. Hi there, this is Power and Politics. I'm David Cochrane in Ottawa. Just last hour, Donald Trump announced his most sweeping round of tariffs yet against virtually every country in the world. A minimum of 10% on all goods going into the United States. That rate is even higher for dozens of countries that Trump claims are taking significant advantage of the United States. Now, there are reports that USMCA-compliant businesses will be exempt. We're still waiting to read the official executive order, a very important thing these days. But what does this all mean for Canadians, for Canada's economy, and for the world? Power and Politics starts right now. All right, it's a big day, so we got a big crowd at the big table as the Power Panel is here to navigate this with us all today. But we want to start with William Pellerin, who is an international trade lawyer with Macmillan Vantage. William, it's good to have you here as we were navigating the latest Trump chaos. It sounds like we're not hit by any of this today. On Liberation Day, we have been liberated. How do you view this?
Yeah, I wasn't sure I would sleep tonight. I thought it would be an all-nighter type evening, but I think I might get some sleep from what I'm seeing, at least at this point. We're not seeing a likely massive escalation of the tariffs at this point. probably further retaliation by the government of Canada might not be in the cards today, at least. It all comes down to the details, of course, but it certainly looks promising on the one hand. Although I will say that if you had asked us, 6 months ago, whether we'd think a 25% tariff on a lot of auto components and on steel is a promising outcome, I think we'd all be losing our minds. So I think we can take some solace that it's not worse than it otherwise already is.
Yeah, look, that's a very important point to make, and to remind the audience is that while there's nothing new, there are still the steel and aluminum tariffs that are in place, and there's still the auto tariffs that are going to come into effect at midnight, and exactly how those get applied is a very complicated sliding scale. So bottom line it for us, I mean, where do you think this leaves us? I mean, we've seen the projections from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Bank of Canada, and others saying if it went universal and across the board, we're talking economic contraction, 150,000 jobs. We have seen hundreds of jobs, maybe thousands of jobs being lost in the affected sectors, but broadly, how do you assess where we are right now?
Yeah, so from my perspective, I see it from our clients and less from the macroeconomic picture.
Sure,
I'm not an economist, but we're working with manufacturers on both sides of the border, and every day it's about strategy and duty mitigation on the duties that are already in place. Because let's not forget, Canada imposed a round of retaliation tariffs in early March. There's retaliation tariffs in mid-March from March 13th for the steel and aluminum. And so there's a lot of work that has to be done already by Canadian businesses that are manufacturing, and their input goods, for example, are subject to tariffs, or their whole supply chain is entirely disrupted. So it will have a massive economic impact. We're seeing that on the ground day to day with every client's coming to us and trying to understand the repercussions and to minimize the harm to their businesses.
When you look at it, there is nothing new here for Canada and Mexico to be hit with, but this volume of countries and this magnitude of trade action, right? Like the European Union, China being hit by 20% tariffs, 34% tariffs, Vietnam 46%. This disruption, because supply chains, while we focus on the North American market, there's global interconnectedness for various components that go into things. I mean, what does this level of absolute complexity do to Canadian businesses who may sell into the United States, but they might source things from a bunch of other places, and who knows how that gets applied?
It's absolutely chaos. There's going to be massive changes to supply chains. So picture, a tire manufacturer in the United States that's importing different components to that tire assembly or wheel assembly from the EU, bringing that into the US, doing some transformation, bringing it into Canada, or attaching that to a large mining truck, for example. Every step of that chain now has to be rethought, right? If the US was counting on a favorable duty treatment with respect to the EU for some of those parts, that no longer works. So there's the Canadian retaliation piece, but the folks down on the ground within the companies are really looking at every step of that chain, and in some cases that's incredibly complex.
The thing too is it's not as if the president stood there today and said everything's great with Canada, right? He still talked about trade deficits. He took aim at supply management. He talked about these what he calls a subsidy and paying for the military, which is not what it is. But it seems more and more likely, William, that when this election is over, whoever it is going to have to sit down with the president and negotiate a whole new trade deal or an updated trade deal, because this pause. You just can't run a company, you can't run an economy like that.
I agree. It's certainly what we're seeing also. The question is, what does that agreement look like, and then can we count on it? I mean, we have an agreement now, and it was negotiated by President Trump 1.0. And so the question is, what's the value of sitting down and signing a new agreement that is all-encompassing if we don't have faith that it'll stick? So that's an important piece of the puzzle. It's a question for politicians to determine, but you're absolutely right. Fundamentally, we have to get back to a place where there is more free trade, fair trade between Canada and the United States.
Yeah, there's that overarching question of whether Trumpism survives Trump, when and if he eventually leaves the White House. But I guess just as a final point, you're saying you were coming in this today not thinking you were going to get any sleep. Okay, there is a pause. There are still those critical sectors of auto, steel, and aluminum hit by this. What's the big question you have right now based on what the clarity we have, such as clarity exists under President Trump? What's the big lingering question you have right now as you look at this announcement today?
I think the big question actually that our clients are asking is what's going to happen with the March 4th and the March 13th retaliation tariffs that Canada has imposed. because this is not a further escalation, but those are in responses to actions that are sticking.
Right.
And a lot of Canadian businesses are wanting to make exceptions or apply for exceptions with the federal government to get those tariffs reduced or not applicable to them and to their supply chains. So a lot of uncertainty, lots of work to be done to get Canadian businesses in.
Right, so whether Canada scales back, it seems like there's no need to go further with what they've done. The question is, do they down tools a little bit to see where this goes?
Correct.
Okay, William Pellerin, trade lawyer, international trade lawyer with the Macmillan Vantage. Appreciate it. Thanks for being here today, sir.
Thanks very much.
Okay, we're going to bring in the power panel for a quick take on what's going on today. Amanda Alvaro is a former Liberal Party communications strategist and co-host of the Beyond a Ballot podcast. Here with me in the studio, we've got Tim Powers. He's worked as a conservative strategist, as a strategist for conservative parties. He's in the middle there. Jordan Likeness is a former NDP strategist, and Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor of The Hill Times. Amanda, let's start with you. I don't know if you celebrate Liberation Day, but this one feels like it went a little bit better than what people were expecting. What's your reaction to what we just heard from the president?
Yeah, agreed. For sure, upside, downside. I mean, the downside was certainly the 25% tariffs on auto that seem to be sticking, steel and aluminum, which are still in place. But we did get, or there has been some communication from the White House that suggested that CUSMA is exempted, and we certainly didn't appear on the large scale chart that he held up to show those reciprocal tariffs. He did take aim at Canada, though, a couple of times early on in his hour-long press conference when he talked about the U.S. subsidizing Canada at $200 billion a year, which is the false claim that he continues to repeat. He took aim at supply management. But things that we didn't hear this time around, the 51st state comments referring to our prime minister as governor, you know, those sort of provocative words that he was using, which seem to have evaporated since the phone call that he had with Prime Minister Carney. So I thought that was interesting, and I think we can breathe a sigh of relief. But for now, with Trump, it's just until, and you just said this a few minutes ago, until you actually analyze the executive order,
right,
we really don't know.
Okay, so I've got something here. This is the fact sheet released by the White House, which accompanies these executive orders. For Canada and Mexico, the existing fentanyl immigration order remains in effect and are unaffected by this order, the new one signed today. This means USMCA compliant goods will continue to see a 0% tariff. Katie Simpson's actually at the White House. I'm told she has these details. So instead of hearing from an amateur like me, let's go to an expert like the CBC's Katie Simpson, who's in Washington, was in the Rose Garden looking at all those charts. Katie, what do you got for us?
David, we have all the some clarity for Canadians after, so many sort of vague statements in terms of, was Canada going to get hit? What's it going to get hit by? All of that kind of stuff. The White House just sent out a fact sheet with a couple of very key, interesting points. And you just started on that path right there. For Canada and Mexico, the existing fentanyl, those border security tariffs, they're going to remain in effect, unaffected by this order. This means USMCA compliant goods will see a 0% tariff. Non-USMCA compliant goods will see a 25% tariff. That's already sort of in place right now. And non-USMCA compliant energy and potash will see a 10% tariff. So that's what is already in place right now. In the event the existing fentanyl and migration orders are terminated, USMCA goods would continue to receive preferential treatment, while non-USMCA compliant goods would be subject to a 12% reciprocal tariff. So for as long as these border tariffs remain in place, the USMCA carve-out continues, according to this fact sheet from the White House. Another thing, Canadians have been deeply concerned about tariffs are going to be stacked on stacked on stacked if they're going to apply multiple sort of layers of tariffs. This fact sheet says some goods will not be subject to reciprocal tariffs. These include steel and aluminum tariffs, autos and auto parts already subject to 232 tariffs, copper, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors. So Canada is already dealing with 25% steel and aluminum tariffs. These are not going to stack on top, according to this statement from the White House. And he's also sort of carved out a number of industries that he's looking to impose additional tariffs on, saying that they're not going to be hit in this retaliation. So in terms of Canada, Canada still is obviously dealing with a mountain of tariffs when it comes to the steel and aluminum tariffs and the auto tariffs that are going to kick in at midnight. But when it comes to additional layers of tariffs, this 10% baseline tariff is not going to apply to Canada and Mexico, and it's not going to be stacked on top of the tariffs that Canada's already dealing with.
Okay, Katie, that is all very helpful as we seek whatever threads of clarity we can get on a day like this. Just to give you a quick sense of what's happening, the federal cabinet is about to meet in 3 minutes. Thank you very much, Katie. We'll hopefully check in with you throughout the show. We're standing by to hear from Prime Minister Mark Carney, who we are told within the next 5, 10, 15 minutes will be stopping to speak with reporters for his response to that. So we will get you to Mark Carney the minute he appears in front of our cameras, because we do want to hear what Canada is going to do with this, whether there is an escalation, a de-escalation, a pausing on this side of the border, based on what we just heard from the United States president in the last little while. Okay, Jean Charest is standing by. He is a former Premier of Quebec, of course, a former Deputy Prime Minister, and a member of the Prime Minister's Council on Canada-U.S. Relations. Jean Charest, I don't know if you're as confused as the rest of us, but I wonder what your sense is. Is this a day for relief on avoiding these global reciprocal tariffs, or still in the middle of deep trade anxiety because of what's happening with auto, steel, and aluminum? How would you describe today?
Well, David, what I see is that we're all suffering from the Stockholm Syndrome. You'll remember the concept. We've been taken hostage by Donald Trump for the last few months, who on a day-to-day basis throws stuff at us and sees whether it sticks to the wall or not, and we react. And now we hear 10%, we conclude it's good news. Actually, when a government announces these things, actually, David, they have a responsibility to be clear. They obviously aren't. And I think they're going to pay a price for that confusion when the markets open tomorrow, because it's going to be difficult for people to work their way through this. What it comes out of this, though, it should be very clear for Canada. The auto sector is hit very hard. And that is going to have a deep impact. It means that we're going to have to look at how we respond to that. As we respond, by the way, we need to be strategic and we need to be intelligent about it. The situation's evolved a lot since we put together an initial package of $125 billion, you remember, on which we consulted, and now we return. So the Prime Minister and his government are going to have a close look at where we need to respond and where we go, and be as pointy as we can. One thing I like about this announcement today is that he's packaging this in legislation that will go to Congress, as opposed to executive orders for which we just have to deal with. That gives us a lot of touch points to be able to respond to what is in this package with congressmen and senators, and that is for Canada a much different playbook than the one we've had to deal with from the beginning of this administration.
No, that is a very good point, because certainly there are a lot of like-minded people in the House of Representatives and in the Senate to Canada and how these trade disputes should be settled, and it does, it makes the midterm elections coming up a whole lot more important in terms of stabilizing these things. But I know there was a meeting of the Prime Minister's Council on Canada-U.S. Relations in the run-up to this before.
Yes.
I'm assuming you didn't know at that time. I don't know if you were given the heads up or if you found out from the chart like the rest of the world. But what's your advice to Mark Carney, knowing what we know now, in terms of how Canada should respond to this? Is this the time to de-escalate on this side of the border, or is it to hold firm, keeping things in place until everything is gone?
Well, as we look at the longer midterm picture, we need to keep everything on the table in terms of options. A. B, be very strategic in what we do, be targeted, as I mentioned, especially if we have legislation in Congress. Then we have a lot of touch points to work with. And our embassy is going to be very busy with all of that. I think we need to take time and take whatever time is necessary to analyze all of this carefully. And once the smoke has cleared and we understand what we're exactly dealing with. And finally, I'd add this, David. The Prime Minister and the President in their conversation seem to agree on a longer-term agreement. That's good news for us. It may not be, or with today's announcement about the present agreement, CUSMA, maybe the Americans want to continue with CUSMA. If that's the case, there has to be a longer-term negotiation that will allow us to have at least some predictability in regards to our trade relationship with the United States.
There's about $60 billion in round numbers in counter tariffs in place, if my math is correct, Mr. Charest. The $30 billion for the initial fentanyl tariffs, let's call them, and then another $30 billion for the steel and aluminum. I don't know if we've done anything just yet on auto. I think the plan was to wait and see. Do you think those will stay in place? I mean, ultimately it's up to Mr. Carney and his cabinet. But it seems like those, the triggering decisions for those have not gone away. So do you think it stays status quo there?
Well, we can look at what it is that we put out there and see whether in this new configuration, it's a whole new configuration, what works and what is the most effective, always keeping in mind. I mean, we all agree that whatever we do, we want to, as much as we can, protect Canadian consumers and Canadian jobs. And so, of course, we should look at it with that view. But also, David, you know, we need to be very clear. This is a world of very bad choices. We only have bad choices when we reply. Yep. The logic of tariffs and counter tariffs is bad for everyone. So that's the world in which we are making choices. And we all wish it were different. But we have to defend our fundamental sovereign interest as we go ahead with this. No, look, the tariff versus tariff, it's a circular firing squad for the citizens and the companies of the various countries. So just as a final point, Mr. Charest, Mark Carney said last week that, you know, that underlying relationship of economic integration, defense and security cooperation, it's over. I mean, how do you see it based on this reprieve today? Are we still in that world that it's like, even if it gets better from this point on, you just got to look elsewhere for the long term? A moment ago on your show, someone mentioned that Trump would leave office at one point. The truth of the matter is Trumpism is with us for the foreseeable future, whether it's Donald Trump or anyone else. Our world and our relationship with the United States has changed forever. Donald Trump, we may thank him in 30 years from now because he will have forced Canada to look at how we operate our economy, how we operate our federal system, and the place that we occupy in the world. But we will never return to the relationship we had before. Jean Charest, we appreciate you joining us on a busy and kinetic day. Let's call it that. We appreciate your time, sir. Thank you. Okay, we're going to get back to the power panel. We heard from Amanda. We've got Jordan Likeness, Tim Powers, and Sherelle Evelyn here. Jordan, let's start with you. I mean, Jean Charest says no matter what, Trumpism is here to stay, and we've just got to deal with that going ahead. I mean, where do you think this leaves things today?
Yeah, I fear he's right about that. There's no indication that these trends of economic nationalism are going to leave the United States anytime soon. And I think today there's a danger that people will want to feel a bit relieved or to see this as good news. But having 25% tariffs on our auto sector, on our steel, on our aluminum, we're still talking about hundreds of thousands of workers who are going to be impacted. Layoffs and shutdowns are going to be coming. This is really serious, and there's a real risk to normalizing those tariffs as well. So I think that there's a moment here where we have an opportunity to calibrate our response. Right. And, you know, the idea of minimally targeted reciprocal tariffs, I think, are going to be very important, ones that harm Canadians the least. But I have to say, I do think politically this is probably a pretty good day for the Liberal campaign. Politically, this is a pretty good day for Prime Minister Mark Carney. There were a lot of scenarios in which this could have gone much worse for him if Trump had come in with tariffs that would have stacked on top of what's already there. But I think the question as we move forward is going to be, what's in place to support the workers who are going to be impacted by this and the industries that are going to be living out these impacts, even as we're in some sort of a negotiating position potentially with the Americans on this? Yeah, look, right now there's liquidity programs and loan programs and changes to EI to help deal with the initial shock of this, but long term is going to need a lot more. We also have to remember, still, like, our EI system is not very good. Only 2 in 5 workers qualify. So there are going to be people who are going to fall through the gaps, and we need to be ready to catch them. Yeah, maybe not in steel and aluminum directly, but in the ripple effect throughout it. That's going to be a challenge. But Tim, you know, Jordan is right. Like, despite the relief that it didn't get worse, when you've got 2 broken arms and a broken leg, it's a relief not to break your ribs, but you've still got a bunch of busted limbs, and these are key industries still being hit by these tariffs.
I don't know about you. I played rugby like that, but you were a little softer. So let's remember that. Yeah, look, there's a small sense of gratification, I suppose, that we can take that weren't hit today, but tomorrow's going to be a bad day for a lot of Canadians, and we are going to be in this abusive partnership as long as Donald Trump is there, unless something changes dramatically. And that is going to be really toiling, and it's not going to go away as much as we would like it to, unless Trump finds some other distraction beyond his crusade on tariffs.
Sherelle, how do you view these developments? Lack of developments? Is a lack of development a development? I don't know anymore after 3 months of Trump.
I don't think anybody knows.
Yeah.
I think the word that was used earlier was exhausting, and I think that's definitely what it is when you're dealing with the president. The thing that did stick out to me, I was thinking about, is what does this do for? Because we're talking about Canada and how this affects the Canadian field, but what about internationally? Are these the types of things that Donald Trump is doing that is actually going to spur that reaction that people have been looking for and wondering, like, can't there be some sort of collective pushback or even just any pushback? Because you talk to European leaders, representatives, and they will repeatedly say, when you say, okay, well, Canadians are asking, where are our friends? Why aren't you sticking up for Canada? And everybody says, we don't want to poke the bear. They don't want to agitate.
Well, so the bear poked them today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So now that it's come exactly to their doorstep, yes, they were usually more concerned about Greenland and Ukraine and things like that. But now these are hits to their own economies. Are they now going to be saying, hey, maybe Canada was onto something and this is something that we should be getting in on? Yeah,
I mean, just to look at the European Union, which is one of the markets Canada would like to pivot to, they're being hit with a 20%, what they call, is kind of Orwellian speak, USA discounted reciprocal tariffs, because they claim the EU essentially hits them with a 39% tariff. So, Japan, a G7 partner, is hit with a 24% USA discounted reciprocal tariff. And so, Amanda, while the list of this is just, it goes on and on and on to the point that Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, the French islands off the coast of Newfoundland, are hit with a tariff, as is Gibraltar. Yeah. There may not be a direct smack on Canada, but there is a sideswipe of global trade that is going to just dampen things everywhere right now. That just is a broad, macro, like a global level economic concern if these go ahead.
For sure. It's the broad global economic ripple effect is what will be like the cascade that comes out of this announcement. And you did still get the sense with him at the mic that everything it's at the whim of Donald Trump, of all people, right? So that chaos, that underlying chaos and uncertainty and unpredictability of what he could do next is still there. How all of these other nations respond, the ripple effect of that, how the markets respond, consumer confidence responds. I mean, it feels like never ending. And certainly when Canada is starting to position itself vis-a-vis some of these other nations to diversify our trading relationships, how will they pivot and how will their pivots affect what we intend to do? So again, it feels like just the beginning, certainly not the end of this ongoing saga with Trump.
Jordan, I wonder, what do you think? We're standing by, just to let people know at home. We're not showing you that door because it's pretty. That's an elevator. We're waiting for the Prime Minister. There's going to be a cabinet meeting starting kind of any minute now. Jordan, I don't know if we'll get the full response from Mark Carney today. I think he wants to meet with his cabinet, see the things, and roll it out tomorrow. What does Carney say to Canadians in this moment on a day like this, do you think?
Well, I think he needs to reassure Canadians that there is a plan to chart a path out of this chaos. And it's this yo-yoing, the threats back and forth, that's really causing so much of the worry for Canadians and for business. And so I think one of the things that we can look for from him is certainly a path forward, perhaps more towards negotiations. And it was interesting to see today that was a pivot on the part of Trump. The idea that he would be making reference to the trade agreement, that is still something that has some weight with him when he's the one who has violated his own trade agreement, is probably a bit of a hopeful sign for the Canadian government that there might be a path there. But I agree. I think that Canada's been very exposed. We've been out there fighting back alone. And so to have some allies around the world joining us in that would be helpful.
Okay, look, while Canada may have been spared from these global reciprocal discounted tariffs, Trump did reference Canada throughout his announcement. Just have a listen to this.
We're going to start being smart, and we're going to start being very wealthy again. We're going to be wealthy as a country because they've taken so much of our wealth away from us. We're not going to let that happen. We truly can be very wealthy. We can be so much wealthier than any country. It's not even believable, but we're getting smart. Nearly a century later, in the face of unrelenting economic warfare, the United States can no longer continue with a policy of unilateral economic surrender. We cannot pay the deficits of Canada, Mexico, and so many other countries. We used to do it. We can't do it anymore.
Okay, that's U.S. President Donald Trump speaking in the Rose Garden a little over an hour ago, I believe it was. Tim, Jordan's point is that Mark Carney needs to come out and kind of reassure Canadians.
how do you reassure them there's a plan to get out of the chaos of the Trump machine when he's got 45 months left in office?
You can't, but what you have to guard against, and this is a problem for Liberals in the past, is any form of triumphalism. You don't want to say today is a big victory and we've held off. And Mark Carney is not likely to say that, but I'm already seeing some social media that suggests not Mark Carney, but others that are trumpeting this, pardon the pun. I dial that down very quickly. I think Mark Carney has to keep saying, we've got your back. We've got your back. Because that is the only thing he controls right now. Canada can assist, how they assist, how quickly they assist, how they respond. He can control that. He has no control over Donald Trump. And I think Canadians want to hear that they will be protected at some level should this continue in the vein it's continuing.
The one thing, Sherelle, that I look at from today that is an extra layer of reassurance is that, you know, in February it was until March 2nd. In March it was until April 2nd. He hasn't said anything yet about May. So we got that going for us.
Early.
You know, yeah, like, you know, maybe I'm grasping at paper straws here. But, you know, it is kind of status quo. We'll figure out where things go with steel, aluminum, and auto. And that's, I think, what we need to hear from the Prime Minister.
Yeah, absolutely, because there are still things that have to be addressed. And as the others have said, people are going to be thinking about, okay, but what have you done for me lately? And if we have a hit that is coming, that we know is coming, might not be an additional hit, but the people want to know, okay, shore us up. Where do we go from here? What certainty can you offer us in these troubling times? Because there is so little certainty with everything. You cannot control, as everybody knows, what Donald Trump is going to do or say on any given day. So the only things the government can do right now is to tell people, we know for what we know is coming, this is what we're doing, and this is how we have your back.
Okay, if you're just joining us, just to catch you up, you're watching Power and Politics. We are standing by to hear from Prime Minister Mark Carney, who will be convening a meeting of his Canada-U.S. Cabinet Committee within the next few minutes. We expect him to arrive and respond to what Donald Trump said in the Rose Garden a little over an hour ago, outlining a global tariff plan from the President of the United States that to this point excludes Canada and Mexico from any additional tariffs. The ones going into effect on the steel and aluminum, already in place on steel and aluminum, and the ones announced, I'm going to say last week, because time is moving fast in this election and this trade war, on the auto sector, will go into effect at midnight tonight. But no additional tariffs on top of the ones that were already in place were imposed here on Canada or on Mexico, on what Donald Trump calls Liberation Day, what the rest of us call April 2nd, and we are standing by to hear from Prime Minister Mark Carney on that as he once again steps off the campaign trail as Liberal leader in that role to step into his parliamentary job as the Prime Minister of Canada in the middle of a trade war with its biggest trading partner. So with all of that said, Amanda, I'm going to start with you, but knowing Mark Carney could dodge around that corner any minute, we'll have to go to Mark Carney. What's your sense of what he needs to say here? I mean, bearing in mind this is a trade war, which is an enormously important thing, happening in an election, which is also an enormously important thing. What do you expect to hear from Mark Carney?
Well, I think a couple of things. I think, first of all, you know, a couple of days ago, we were all talking about the devastation of 25% tariffs on our auto sector, right? Those tariffs are happening, and they're happening at midnight tonight. And so I think that there is a temptation, even I had the temptation to breathe a sigh of relief that we weren't included in the reciprocal tariffs. But the worst case scenario, or one of the worst case scenarios around the auto sector, is happening, and it's happening today. So I think the Prime Minister needs to address that, needs to address this critical sector, needs to address particularly Ontarians, and needs to talk about how Canada will respond. I don't expect that he will have that plan in place because, as you said, he's still meeting with his cabinet. He's still meeting with the Canada-US Committee. But Canadians will want to know how we're responding to that. I think the second thing is, I will build on what Tim said. I think that there is an early temptation to call this a win for the Liberals. And I think that that is territory that they should avoid. Yeah. I think certainly the tone has changed, and we can appreciate that for as long as it exists. That phone call happened between Prime Minister Carney and the President, and suddenly he had dropped some of the negative and kind of punitive words that he was using when he referred to Canada. And I think we can all be hopeful that potentially that signals the ability for this relationship to dare I say, even flourish in the future? Potentially, but it can easily swing the other way. And it could swing the other way in the course of this election. So I think it would be foolish for the Liberals to go so far down that road that they claim a victory before they should. I think he needs to take a really tempered approach, ease some of the anxieties that Canadians are feeling around some of these new tariffs, while at the same time really talking about how Canadians and Canada is poised to position itself on the backside of these tariffs.
Okay, Amanda, we're just going to pause it there for a second. Cabinet is pushed, is what I'm being told, and we're likely not going to hear from Mark Carney until about 6:15 Eastern Time, so a half an hour later than we originally expected to hear from him. With that delay and that window of time available to us, I'm going to bring in Matthew Holmes. He is the Executive Vice President of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. Matthew, the work the Chamber has done has been very helpful in looking at which cities and which areas are the most trade exposed in this trade war and the most vulnerable. What are your thoughts on what happened today and how that all affects the economic outlook here in the country?
Well, I think we have to take this and pause and watch what happens next. As we've been living through, this changes day by day. And I think the rest of the world is waking up to the nightmare that Canada's been living. And the American dream is going to lead to a lot of sleepless nights around the world. I think tactically, Canada probably benefits from just standing in the tall grass for a bit longer and watching this one play out. I think we can't forget steel and aluminum, our auto sector, our agri-food sector that's being faced with tariffs from China as well. And I think that's an important part here. What, the rock that Trump is throwing right now is hitting that pond, and it's going to have a ripple effect around the world, and Canada's going to be living with that as well. So it's not just our trade with the U.S. that's impacted here, it will be a global effect. And what the markets do tomorrow and what we see in the days to come could be quite damaging.
Well, that's a very important point to remember, right? Because, this is not just a bilateral trade disruption. This is a fundamental, reshaping he's trying of global trade. I mean, 34% tariffs on China on top of what's already there. 20% of the European Union. You just look at it, right? 24% in Japan, 26% on India. All the big 10 economies on Earth being hit by the biggest economy on Earth. So, I mean, what sort of waves do we get from the ripples he's causing there in global trade? I mean, what is the risk to Canada, even with the spare of direct action? How vulnerable are we to that?
Well, we're a trading nation. We're an importer, we're an exporter, and we're one of the world's top in both of those categories. So what happens to the global economy happens to Canada and Canadian business. Obviously, we're over-indexed with the U.S., and it's an important trade relationship for us. And as we look to the diversification of our markets in response to this threat that we've been facing, the health and the integrity of those other markets and our ability to trade with them will also be important. So it's a long-term impact, and I think this is a very disruptive moment for the global economy. It's one that will impact Canada. It's going to lead to compromised markets around the world. Job losses, recession is basically guaranteed in this current situation for Canada, likely for the U.S. And I think
even with us being spared today, just the global disruption could lead to a recession?
I think that's still in the cards for this year. We have to watch that closely. And the other factor here that I think is missing is what is this going to do to the price of goods in America? This president was elected on affordability, on housing. All of those are going to be incredibly damaged, if not permanently, from this move. And so the time it takes for that to ripple through to the economy, whether that's the stock market or just the grocery stores, that will be, I think, a key decision maker. And you mentioned our research earlier from the Business Data Lab at the Canadian Chamber. That's been our effort to make this a subnational conversation for Canada. So what are the governors feeling and what are they saying? What are mayors in U.S. cities thinking about their critical employers, the jobs at stake, the supply chains that they rely on? We want that conversation. We don't want this big, GDP conversation. We want it to be real and local because that's what's going to turn the midterms.
Yeah, Bobby Kennedy once said GDP is a measurement of everything except that which makes life worthwhile. And it's hard to look at a macro GDP contraction and relate that down. But this is already hundreds, if not thousands, of people in the steel industry. The auto sector is going to face, these are good paying jobs, in towns and cities that this is the core of the economy there, right?
Absolutely.
And this is what we're talking about. So, when you look at this, this chart he held up,
beautiful,
which is a great way to tell the world the economy is flipping upside down. the incentive for diversification and under-indexing maybe on the United States, this seems like a moment that accelerates those impulses. I know it's going to take a while for companies to change their supply chains, but this could be, I don't want to say a positive thing, but there's potentially, in every disruption, there's an opportunity.
Absolutely, and we have to take that. And there are things, I mean, the reality is the Canadian business feels a tariff on day one. That impact is immediate, and it's quite notable. The time it takes to make our economy more competitive, more resilient, the trade infrastructure we need to get to Tidewater, to have the rails and roads and ports that we need for our trade diversification, and just to connect internally for internal trade across the country, that takes time and investment. And then moving to other countries, moving to other cultures, other languages, developing those business relationships where, you know, there's always going to be a significant amount of trade with the U.S. There's trade adjacency there.
Yeah.
Of course we're going to trade with them. We have a common language for the most part. We have a lot of shared history. We have a shared border. We have infrastructure that connects us integrally. But the investment and the win from moving to other markets is all win, and we should take that. And I look at this when I speak to our members, I talk about it like an insurance policy. Of course you're going to have your number one client or customer. But what's your number two? What's your number three? And are you taking care of those?
Yeah, and look, and the Bobby Kennedy I quoted was senior, not junior. He says very different things. But in this moment, internal trade is obviously going to get a greater level of urgency in this. The numbers we've seen, the optimism on internal trade that could add like $200 billion to the country's GDP, does that apply in a Canadian economy that is completely sideswiped by the actions of the U.S.? Do you know what I mean? Like, do those numbers hold if things are so completely disrupted? Because it can help, but it doesn't seem like it's not going to replace the U.S. How does internal trade help and its value affected in a moment like this?
Well, there's a couple of ways of looking at this. One is, if not now, then when? I mean, this is our moment.
Sure.
We need to be bold. We need to take action on this thing. We can't continue to be 13 different economies standing side by side and not playing together in the sandbox. We have to be one economy. That suddenly makes us a real G7 nation when we become that economy. We're suddenly an economy worth investing in, because you're not going to be facing all of these different levels of regulatory barriers and different systems and standards, and whether you can work in this province or that province. And so that actually makes us more competitive on the world stage when we deal with the internal trade barriers as well. But yes, the $200 billion, the 4% GDP, those numbers that you see, those are long-term numbers. That's an investment in our future that we have to make. But it's not going to be overnight. No, it's not going to replace trade with the United States right away. But it's something we should do.
Okay, just one last question. Maybe it's too soon to have this math done, but sort of the broad-based global tariff scenario that your group did, I think it forecasted about 1.3, 1.7% economic contraction over the second quarter if these go on for about 3 months, 150,000 job losses. With what happened today, I mean, are we talking a half of that, a third of that? Like, where do you see it fitting in the modeling, or do you just need to start that work from scratch?
Well, we did two studies. We did first a 10% and then a 25%. So with the 25%, we saw 2.6% GDP contraction in Canada and 1.6% contraction in the United States in a retaliatory environment such as what we will see in response to today. And so I think we still have to watch that closely, because it's not just the trade and what Canada is facing, it's how the entire trade environment is complicated. And just the administrative burden, the complexity, the confusion. Uncertainty is bad for business. And what we saw today, even though there was a beautiful chart, is a whole lot of uncertainty.
This makes it worse. The implications of that chart are pretty profound on a global scale.
Yeah, and when you have an administration that is actively diminishing its own workforce, quite actively, you have to ask the question, who's going to administer this? How are they going to do the math?
Yeah, Doge can only do so much, it seems. All right, Matthew Holmes, Executive Vice President of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. We appreciate your time. Thanks for being here today, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, let's go back to the power panel as we wait to hear from Mark Carney, other political leaders, and other guests coming in. Jordan, I don't know if I feel better or worse after that analysis. You know,
I think worse.
It's the direct hit, right, is smaller than everybody feared. The global hit, though, and the ripples of that, it's not a good time ahead.
And I think it just speaks to the order of magnitude of shifts that we're going to see as a result of these tariffs, not just in Canada, but globally. And I think that politically, as we're having that conversation in the campaign here, that's an important thing to bear in mind. The shifts that we're talking about making, to decouple our reliance from the United States are really significant. And they are, they are really going to take quite a long time and quite a lot of government investment. And so I think, one of the things when we look at what makes it companies want to invest in Canada, of course, it's hard infrastructure, it's incentives, it's things like our regulatory environment, but it's also our social safety net. It's also the fact that we have a good quality of life here. So there's going to be a role for whatever government comes in making sure that those things are upheld and that we're doing the things to create the right business environment, yes, but also to protect a standard of living here in Canada, because we're about to go through some really difficult times. And I think one of the other things I'm struck by is that up until now, Canada has actually been treated worse than many of the other countries on that list.
Yeah.
So we've been out there on our own, sort of leading and also fighting back. And so today, even though this is terrible news, truly, for workers and for the global economy, people around the world are going to be impacted terribly by this. But we are going to have company now in this fight, in this fight against the tariffs, and in being able to put pressure domestically within the United States leading up to the midterms on this issue in the hopes that perhaps Trump can be persuaded to change his mind. But I don't think we should ever lose sight of the fact that his stated intention is to hurt us.
Yeah.
That is what he said repeatedly, and one good phone call and is not going to change that. So we have to be on guard as we move forward.
Yeah, he doesn't want partners or competitors.
That's right.
He wants markets and suppliers of resources. And this list, Tim, is not just a list of who he's targeting, it's a list of potential allies for Canada as they try to find ways to push back against what the U.S. is doing.
If Trump wants to be an isolationist, he's on the right path to doing it. To pick up on what Jordan said, at a certain point, some of the more timid nations are going to say, you know what, enough. There are other partners out there. There are other suppliers out there. There are other countries like us who want to make trade work. I don't know how good that will be for the U.S. in the long run, but I go back to something Jean Charest, said about half an hour ago when he was on. What are the markets going to be like tomorrow? Because that still matters to Trump. Yeah. And if the backside goes out of those markets for a couple of days, will he retreat as he has done before?
But he hasn't really they've lost trillions in market value, and he's still going with it, Tim.
He is, but I don't want to be the spewer of conspiracy theories. There's somebody in that world that's benefiting as a consequence of that. But at a certain point, you can only, even in the trillions of dollars, David, you can only lose a certain amount till the people who you think give you validation. Because what does Trump want more than anything else? Validation. And the markets and the business leaders that are there are his validators. He likes being, to use a term used in other circumstances, fluffed. He likes to be fluffed. He likes to be seen.
Yes, we're not going to talk about those circumstances, but Sherelle, what are your thoughts on what we've heard from Matthew Holmes and everyone else here?
Thinking about that global, ripple effect, Trump today in the Rose Garden, he talked about, to pick up the word that Tim just used there, that isolationist. He said they were wrong about NAFTA, they were wrong about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. They said, they told me if you terminate that, we'll do poorly. And, they told me that tariffs coming in my first term would damage the economy. And he said, but we had the greatest economy the country's ever seen. So there's all of these things that he says, he's clearly living in some sort of alternate reality. So if the global community can kind of come together and form its own, this sounds silly, but it form its own reality essentially that says, actually, we're living in the real world and we are all going to continue to work together because we are part of these various trade deals. And there are a lot of countries out there that want a lot more access to Canada. And through various trade deals, whether, you have European Union deal, which isn't fully ratified by all the countries that are involved, but there are people who have said these things have made real tangible differences and we want to do more. So as long as we can kind of build on that, looking at, hey, everybody's economy is going to be hit by this. Yeah. Why don't we work together and leave him in his little corner? Then, maybe there's something to that.
Yeah, he's taken trade action against people like China, the big bad actors of global trade, non-market economy, state-controlled, all of these things doesn't play by rules. But he's also tariffed, NATO and the G7, and NAFTA gets a reprieve except for what's already there. So Donald Trump has announced his global reciprocal tariffs today. So how is this going over inside the United States? Chuck Todd is an American political analyst and a former host of NBC's Meet the Press, and he joins me now. Chuck Todd, it's good to have you on. What's your reaction to what we've heard from your president today?
Look, we're in uncharted territory. I mean, we haven't had a tariff regime like this really as a country since the 1930s, almost 100 years ago. More than 100 years ago, this philosophy was even mainstream in our politics. So, look, here's the difficulty with covering President Trump, and you guys are experiencing this firsthand, which is. You don't know how serious he is. He's starting something. Is he willing to deal? Well, most of the time you assume yes, but it does appear if there is one, and I say this, I'm not trying to be snarky, but Donald Trump is not somebody who has a sturdy ideology.
Yeah.
Except it appears on one issue, and that is the belief that tariffs are a net positive. Now, look, it does fit his larger philosophy of how he views the world. Number one, he views the world as if there are the big powers and there are small powers. And I think he sees the world via the prism of China, Russia, the United States. Hard stop.
Mm-hmm.
And then everybody below is derivative. And so he sees these relationships as saying, hey, we're the big dog. And everybody should have to sort of essentially respond to us. And I think he views everything in a very binary way and a bilateral way, right? He doesn't even believe in multilateral agreements. I mean, and so 6 months ago, I would have said, these are all negotiating tactics. And every single one of these tariffs, because at the end of the day, what he really enjoys is everybody has to come to him. Everybody has to come to him. If you're a corporation, you have to come to him looking for reprieve from a tariff. If you're a country, maybe you'll offer something as a deal. But I really think he philosophically does not believe in this integrated global economy.
Right.
I think he views it through national security reasons that all of the United States industrial base has to be within the borders of the United States. Perhaps he's going to start viewing the United States as North America, and we can have that discussion, if you will, and that's also an uncomfortable conversation. And so that's why I'm sitting here saying it's uncharted. The last term, he was surrounded by people who didn't believe in this tariff regime. This term, his nearest advisors are more likely to actually believe in this. And I think that you should assume these tariffs aren't going away anytime soon.
No, that's certainly the impression we have here in Canada. Like you mentioned the 1930s and the Smoot-Hawley tariff regime that Herbert Hoover signed, a big part of the Great Depression. He's talking about the 1880s when tariffs were a primary source of revenue and the U.S. was rich, and this predates things like income tax. But he's tanking the markets. He's alienating his allies. He's depressing global trade. He's probably going to drive up prices, and he's probably going to drive up unemployment and anger and frustration inside the United States. So what does he have to see? Like, how many times do you touch a hot stove before you stop touching the hot stove?
Look, this is the thing. I think many of us thought the markets, the financial markets would be the guardrail here. That nothing else would be the guardrail but the financial markets. But look, he does not, despite all the shiny metal object conversation about a third term, he is actually behaving as if he knows he's not going to meet the voters again. Mm-hmm. And so this is what I think makes him that much harder to predict and frankly harder to negotiate with, because I think he almost views this as kind of a Thelma and Louise moment. Hey, I'm going over the cliff.
Yeah.
I don't care. I'm done.
It feels like we're in that convertible with him, though, Chuck Todd.
Well, I mean, and that's the way. And look, I'm sitting here. This couldn't be politically dumber. Like, there's no part of this that makes sense to me. It's the economy is going to tank. It's going to be stagnant at best. The irony here is that let's accept his premise that eventually this is going to regrow the American industrial base. We're talking a decade. But the fact of the matter is, this is the equivalent of 100 years ago, a government trying to save the block of ice business. Okay, right. Just as refrigeration was becoming, you're like, oh, but we got to save these jobs, the guys who cut the big blocks of ice. We've got to preserve this economy. The globalization of the economy. We talk about 100 years ago. Well, 100 years ago, we didn't have air travel. Right, 100 years ago, you didn't have a supply chain that could be instantaneously taken advantage of quickly, and you could move parts around, and parts could be manufactured in one country and literally shipped to another, then applied to the vehicle. Let's say, if we're just talking about cars, and all done for, in theory, less cost, unless you start popping up all these tariffs. So, look, I don't know what else to say other than the question is, how bad does the economy have to get until his party turns on him?
Yeah.
And I think we're a good 6 to 9 months away from being anywhere near that. And I'm probably being optimistic.
Yeah, yes, and then it might be the midterms. But your point, and Chuck Todd, we have to say goodbye because we're waiting to hear from the Prime Minister. But your point about how he's not seeking re-election, and that makes him a little bit more invulnerable. Senior Canadian officials have said that very same thing to me. He's 78. He's not running again. He's got nothing to lose, and that's a tough situation to be in when you're a country like Canada. Chuck Todd, it was good to meet you. Thank you for coming on the show today. We appreciate your time today, sir.
Thank you. Good luck. Sorry about it. I feel like I have to apologize being an American for trying to tank your economy. I mean, this is just terrible.
Well, look, normally Canadians are the ones saying sorry all the time, but that just shows you what he's done to the continental order.
Yes, that's for sure.
All right, Chuck Todd, American political analyst, former host of Meet the Press. Thank you, sir. Okay, while we wait for Mark Carney, countdown is about 6.5 minutes to hear from him. Tim, that didn't reassure me. I mean, Chuck Todd's been covering U.S. politics for a long time. He knows what's going on there, and his point that the markets haven't done it, the party hasn't done it, the data hasn't done it, and he's politically invulnerable at this moment.
But I go back to if there is some light in what Chuck Todd said there, it's that 6 to 9 month horizon. But man, you can do a lot of damage in 6 to 9 months.
Oh boy, can you ever?
Because at some point, somebody in the Republican Party is gonna get with it and say this is just not working, because they do want to run, they do want to be president, they do want to do something else, and Trump is pulverizing. Not just the world, but will be pulverizing his own economy. And look, things are starting to go off the rails a little bit there, whether it's the behavior of some of his cabinet secretaries, things around Elon Musk, even the people who supported him. If they don't find some economic reward for themselves, they feel the America being great again, they are going to lose patience.
Yeah. Jordan, your thoughts?
I think it's an optimistic read of the muscle that's left within the Republican Party to control Trump, to be really frank. I think that I think you have to get past the midterms. You have to see some real punishment there before that might kick in. And that's a long time for this damage to hurt economies around the world, including in Canada. So I don't know what it is that's going to rein him in, because it's clear that markets are no longer the barrier that they were at the beginning. And he and his team have found a way to rationalize all of the value they're taking out of the markets, and they just don't see it as the downside that they once did. So that puts Canada in a very difficult position, and I think it will be increasingly important to look to our allies around the world to confront this together.
Yeah, Sherelle, I mean, going back in history, like a lot of journalists, we've all read about Watergate. It was kind of the Republicans in the House and the Senate that ultimately got Nixon to say knock it off and resign. This is not that Republican Party, right? They've gone from small C conservative to big C cult over the last 10 years, and they're all in on him because he controls everything. And they're just not the pressure point that you would think exists in a divided, political system like that.
Right. I mean, there is a little bit of pushback, but it is from the people who've kind of had their time and are, have already fallen out of favor. The Mitch McConnells of the world, they are the people who are, getting up and, today and talking about how the rationale again for these tariffs, the fentanyl rationale doesn't hold water and those types of things. So there is a little bit of that. Right. Whether or not that spreads to, to have some sort of, grand mass, I don't know if that's going to be the case. Like I said, these are people who've already kind of made their peace and said, well, I'm on my way out anyway, so, might as well try to find my backbone that I lost somewhere along the line. But yeah, it is Donald Trump's party for as long as he is in charge of it in the White House, and we will see people sucking up and doing what they can because they want to be as close to power as possible. And as long as that is going to be the case, we are in Canada and the rest of the world are going to be in for a rough ride simply because there's nobody to hold him back.
Yeah, Mitch McConnell had a big chance with the January 6th stuff and didn't take it. And Susan Collins and Murkowski, they're always exhausted up to the point of actually doing something, and they never take the action. Amanda, your final thoughts on just what we've heard there, with the analysis of the U.S. situation, what it means for us here.
Well, I think that the word cult is just so, aptly used now, because you have to agree that for this plan to actually work, it requires the American buy-in based on words, based on language, based on misinformation, based on false promises, despite all of the evidence in front of them, right? Despite the fact that stocks have lost their gains since his election, despite the fact that consumer confidence is down, despite the fact that economists say that, en masse prices will go up. There's still this belief in his words that he's, force feeding the American people. And I thought one last point, interesting today when we saw the auto workers spokesperson take the mic, and you saw this goalpost kind of moving, right? We're going to feel this promise of the golden age. We're going to feel this make America wealthy again promise become realized 6-9 months. But then he actually started using 3 and 4 years from now.
Yeah.
So as long as they're able to keep people buying what he's selling by moving those goalposts, might not be tomorrow, might not be 6 months from now, but 3 years from now, we're going to hit the golden age. You get him butted right up against that next election.
Yeah, it's going to be. This is going to go well beyond whatever trade pause we're in and this election, and for the next year and a half for sure, at least until those midterm elections, it seems. All right, we got to say goodbye to the power panel because we could keep them here until the midterm elections, but they do have lives. You need to go. Amanda Alvaro, Jordan Likeness, Tim Powers, and Sherelle Evelyn, thank you all so much for being here on yet another wild day. And because it's a wild day, well, I've got to bring in Rosie. The chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton, joins me now as we wait for the Prime Minister. We're showing you that. Rosie, we've seen cabinet ministers going in. No one's stopping and talking.
Nope.
We saw Chief of Staff Marco Mendicino go in. We're expecting to hear from Mark Carney. What are you hearing? What's the latest we can expect from the government? The next
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is that when there is something to say on this, it's very clear that it is the Prime Minister who does the talking. That is a little bit different than we've seen with the previous Prime Minister. So it is him explaining where we're at, and it is him explaining what this means and what the government is going to do. I did want to go back to the auto sector thing, which I know you talked about lots there, because it is bad, of course. It's not good for Canada. But again, it does only apply to all non-U.S. content, right? So it's not as bad as it might be for other.
As a percentage, but the administrative burden is.
I mean, right? That's all crazy, right? Yeah. We agree, and we don't know how that will work or how quickly that could be put in place or what that might do to the industry in the short term. But I did want to caveat that it's not going to be 25% on autos. It'll be something else, to be determined. And obviously, when the auto sector is so deeply integrated, it's going to be problematic, and I'm sure will still lead to job losses. But it is not quite as brutal as there was. Also on the steel and aluminum, that remains, and that, as we know, has already caused job losses and is creating all sorts of supply chain issues for people inside the country. Politically, this was going to go one of two ways. We were going to get slapped with the big tariffs, and Mark Carney was going to be able to come out and say, this is why I should be the Prime Minister, because I need to deal with this. Or we were going to end up where we are today, where he can say, I'm the Prime Minister, I'm the best person to deal with this. Like, it becomes a very, I think, challenging political environment going forward, because the opposition parties, the other candidates, the other leaders need to find a way now to chip away at the fact that Canada was left out of the totality of the tariffs. And I think that is a challenging political moment, given where the ballot box question seems to be headed.
Yeah, we have our 2-minute notice that Mark Carney will be coming up those stairs that we're showing you there on the screen and stopping to speak with reporters. My understanding, Rosie, correct me if I'm wrong, is he will speak in English, he will speak in French, he will not be taking questions. No. And I don't think, Rosie, we're going to see sort of the formal response to calibration of measures or anything like that today. I think they want to meet as a cabinet, assess things overnight, and then come out with something
Yeah,
tomorrow.
I mean, listen, I would be surprised if there were further counter tariffs, given there were not new tariffs put on us.
Exactly.
So that's usually how these things are done. He is going to meet with first ministers tomorrow at sometime in the morning, mid-morning, and he will have a press conference tomorrow where he will talk about where things are at. But if the goal for the Prime Minister was to get to a space where there could be a broader negotiation around CUSMA, whether it's this Prime Minister or another one. I do take what the President said today as an indication that that's where he is also headed.
It seems that way.
It seems that way. And I think putting supply management on the table in the way that he did is also troubling for Canadians. And I expect that will be some questions for leaders tomorrow. Is there any scenario under which you would accept putting that on the table? If you answer yes to that, you can pretty much count on Quebec saying goodbye to you in terms of a candidate. But those are the kinds of pressure points that we're going to get into, I think, starting tomorrow as we sort of decipher what the President was talking about.
Yeah, and Rosie, just as we stand by waiting for Mark Carney, I mean, supply management, obviously important in every province, but of outsized importance in Quebec.
Yeah, a little bit in Ontario too.
Yeah, and you've got the energy sector, of course, in Alberta. It shows you these fault lines that exist within the country in the middle of an election because of the pressure points the President is able to target, squeeze, and poke with whatever demand he puts on the table in this particular environment, because it pits region against region and makes impossible choices.
Yeah, and listen, if the Prime Minister does not respond appropriately now and tomorrow, that is also the potential weakness there that Pierre Poilievre and others could pick apart. It may not be the worst case scenario, but it still will demand a response from the government, at very least in terms of support for workers in these industries that are still going to be hit. And I think I understand that there's some fertilizer that's been targeted, so maybe there's a handful of new tariffs, I don't know. So, but it will demand some kind of response, both tonight and tomorrow. And if it doesn't hit the mark, excuse the pun, that will open him up for attacks tomorrow. I don't think we're going to hear from Pierre Poilievre tonight, although I know that they're trying to get him to respond at his rally as well.
Yeah, his rally, though, is a difficult place for him to do this, right? Because as we've talked throughout this election, I mean, they are trying to find a way to turn the Trump issue around for them, right? Because he sort of listed Donald Trump amongst the problems Canada already faces rather than sort of putting it as the paramount challenge that Canada faces. And as people like Fred Delory and others who have been on the show talk about, the Conservative coalition, because Fred ran the campaign in 2021, there's a share of that is, they're confiscating MAGA hats at rallies. They do like Donald Trump, support him. Maybe those numbers are declining, but you're just caught in a very difficult political situation in trying to calibrate to a response like this.
Yeah, and now you're caught. So the challenge was real yesterday, and now it's even realer, because now you're in a situation where someone who is the Prime Minister of Canada is certainly not going to take a victory lap of any kind, but he is going to be able to say, here are the things that I've done. And that is why you vote for me. That becomes part of the campaign narrative. And listen, Conservatives don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear that today. But it will demand, I think, a change in their response. Doubling down on the same thing after today, after what the Prime Minister says now, I'm not sure is going to work. And I will say this is also happening on a day when most of the leaders, with the exception of Pierre Poilievre, are heading to Montreal tomorrow to be part of a live interview segment that Radio-Canada does with every leader. Pierre Poilievre is doing it remotely. But there again, opportunity for the leaders to have a clear message to mostly Quebec and French-speaking people in this country, but an opportunity again to find a way to, in Pierre Poilievre's case, make a different case, and in Mark Carney's case, make the case about action, which is the verb that he seems to like the most in his campaign.
But Rosie, in some ways, what happened today, right, with the big giant chart that the President held up in the Rose Garden, it kind of moves the focus and the urgency a little beyond the moment of what's he going to do to Canada now? And we had Matthew Holmes in here from the Canadian Chamber of Commerce talking about all of these tariffs on all of these countries on all of these pages on all of those charts. that's a potential global recession that you're talking about now.
Yeah.
And the conversation is not just about how do you deal with Trump in the moment, it's how do you deal with all of that fallout after April 28th.
I think the question actually becomes more complicated. You're right. It's not just about the United States and our trading partner and any kind of reassurance we can take from today. And I know not everyone will take it that way. Some people will, some people won't. But it also becomes what kind of leader do you want to take on what might be a global recession, what might be a redefining of trade corridors and partners, that might be a question where you have to choose your alliances. You know, if the EU is suddenly being tariffed at 25% and we have nothing, what are we doing then? How are we positioning ourselves with the EU and the UK and others? So I think it is it's going to be a fascinating challenge in the campaign now to deal with the direct threat from Donald Trump, which has been put on ice to some extent, but also how this is going to upend the world, the markets tomorrow, and how Canada then makes sure that it has the stability and fortitude economically to get through that. Because you're right, the winds of this are going to catch us, either directly because we are being tariffed on some instances, or indirectly because the world will be in economic disarray.
We're showing you this image. This is the staircase that leads up to where the cabinet room is, and where Mark Carney, we are told, is on his way. So we should be hearing from the Liberal leader, the Prime Minister, in the next little while, as he once again removes himself from the daily activity of the campaign trail to step into his role as the Prime Minister of Canada. Though, Rosie, that does give him a tremendous advantage, the ability to be able to campaign from the Prime Minister's podium, so to speak, whether it's literal or metaphorical like it might be in this particular moment. And with all of this instability, if you're the incumbent government, it gives you a tremendous inoculation against arguments for change, which in a campaign like this, right, which we thought it was going to be about on January 2nd, but on April 2nd, it may not be.
It also, I think, you know, frankly, the CV that Mr. Carney has is also a part of the conversation going forward. You know, whether you think that he has weaknesses or not, he does have experience in this field, and certainly has a track record of dealing with some of these kinds of headwinds. So I think that also becomes challenging. Now, I am just trying to sort of think about what are the potential sort of vulnerabilities for the Liberals going forward. Obviously, the most obvious one is something else happens, right?
Sure.
Donald Trump changes his mind on Friday, and suddenly we do have tariffs, and then you have to wear that too. So it is the unknowable factor of Donald Trump and what he may or may not say in the days ahead, in the whatever day, how many days we have left, 25, 26, that become, I think, you know, sort of not a fear factor for the Liberals, but certainly a concern, because you cannot assume that you have this managed, and you cannot assume that it is done and dealt with.
Okay, we're seeing some security walking up those stairs. Usually when the RCMP walks in, the Prime Minister soon follows. There's his official photographer. There appears to be some of his staff, so we should be seeing Mark Carney any minute after you see the political staffers scrambling there. And there, of course, is Mark Carney, the Prime Minister. Let's listen in.
Je vais prononcer quelques mots.
I'll say a few words.
So, President Trump has just announced a series of measures that are going to fundamentally change the international trading system. Now, in doing so, he has preserved a number of important elements of our relationship, the commercial relationship between Canada and the United States. But the fentanyl tariffs still remain in place, as do the tariffs for steel and aluminum. As of this evening, the tariffs on automobiles will enter into force, and the U.S. has signaled that there will be additional tariffs in so-called strategic sectors, pharmaceuticals, lumber, and semiconductors. So we're in a situation where there is going to be an impact on the U.S. economy, which will build with time. In our judgment, it will be negative on the U.S. economy. That will have an impact on us. But the series of measures will directly affect millions of Canadians. We're going to fight these tariffs. with countermeasures. We are going to protect our workers, and we are going to build the strongest economy in the G7. In a crisis, it's important to come together, and it's essential to act with purpose and with force. And that's what we will do. Alors, en français, si je peux. Monsieur le Président Trump, il vient
President
d'annoncer
Trump
une série
has
de
just
mesures
announced a series of measures
qui seront changées. The system
that will change the international trading system in a fundamental manner. However, he has preserved some major aspects of the Canada-US trading relationship. But at the same time, the unjustified tariffs hitting aluminum and steel remain in place. And this evening, the tariffs in the auto sector will go into effect. And the U.S. administration also pointed out that there will be tariffs applied to strategic sectors, as they put it, such as lumber, semiconductors, and pharmaceutical products. Altogether, there will be impacts on millions of Canadians right across the country. We will fight these tariffs, and we will protect our workers, and we will build the strongest economy in the G7. In a crisis, what is important is to be united and to act with strength and purpose. Now, today I had a meeting with the U.S.-Canada Council, and now there will be a meeting of the Canada-U.S. Cabinet Committee, and tomorrow morning I will be meeting with the premiers of the provinces and territories, and after all of that, there will be a response.
Canada-U.S. Council. I will shortly have a meeting. We will have a meeting of the Cabinet Committee, Canada-U.S. Cabinet Committee. Tomorrow morning, we will convene First Ministers of the provinces and territories, and we will have more to say after we have taken those soundings. And we'll be back to you shortly.
Okay, that is Prime Minister Mark Carney heading into a meeting of his Canada-U.S. Cabinet Committee, saying that what Donald Trump announced today fundamentally changes the international trading system. And while it did preserve a number of the elements of the Canada-U.S. trading relationship, you're still looking at the moves on auto, steel and aluminum, the various goods that were targeted under the so-called fentanyl tariffs, for lack of a better term, and warning that there's still action to come potentially on pharmaceuticals, lumber, semiconductors, and this will affect millions of Canadians. And Rosemary Barton, the chief political correspondent for the CBC, is here with me. And Rosie, millions of Canadians, a negative impact on the U.S. economy, on the Canadian economy, and another week where he's going to meet with the premiers and announce another formal response to the United States.
Yeah, I mean, a remarkable moment on day 11, I think, of the campaign trail, where, again, the Liberal leader has to get into Prime Minister mode, and he did that there, talking about the ongoing potential threats, which I think is important to say because it's true, but also important to say politically if you're trying to make your ballot question about Donald Trump, but also talked about the things that Canada needs to do for workers in the industries that are going to be touched directly. And as you heard there, we'll hear more about what kind of countermeasures are on the table after he meets with Cabinet, with the premiers. At some point tomorrow, he'll come out and tell Canadians what else he's going to do. So not someone who was saying this is a victory.
No, definitely not. Someone
saying there's a little something here that helps the relationship, but there's work to be done. Yeah.
But fundamentally change the international trading system is not a small comment, right? And, and this is it speaks to just what actually has been unleashed here today.
Yeah, and an economist, a trained economist, who's saying things are going to be pretty bad in the United States, and so that will be pretty bad for us, is not nothing either.
Okay. All right, Rosie, thank you so much. That's CBC's chief political correspondent, Rosemary Barton. Well, U.S. President Donald Trump says he's slapping dozens of countries around the world with so-called reciprocal tariffs. And while he's chosen to spare his NAFTA partners, at least today, he's still hitting Canada with auto tariffs at midnight. When the original NAFTA was negotiated and signed in 1992, U.S. Trade Representative Carla Hills was the chief American negotiator that ushered in that new era of free trade. So, what does Ambassador Hills think of Trump's tariffs now? Well, as luck would have it, Ambassador Hills joins me now. Ambassador, it's good to meet you. Thank you so much for being here and for waiting so long so we could hear what the Prime Minister had to say. I just wonder what's your reaction to what we've heard now from the leaders of Canada and the United States throughout the afternoon?
I'm very concerned about where we stand on trade. You know, Canada is our largest trading partner. The reciprocal trade tariffs that our president announced today are just tremendously harmful. They not only equal the tariffs that others have, but he has ratcheted them up to cover what he deems to be unfair policies. And so it's really going to hit our economy as well as our friends and allies that have been affected. One good thing is that Canada is not affected by these reciprocal tariffs. But the 25% tariffs that have been imposed apparently will stand. I know that there are people in our Congress who are going to try to move strongly against it. But right now, we're in a period of enormous uncertainty. You're going to feel it in the markets. This uncertainty and incredulous trade action will have a very adverse effect here in the United States as well as with our friends and allies.
Ambassador, when you look at it, and in just the disruption of the relationship between Canada and the United States, which I don't think I'm exaggerating when I call it one of the most successful, if not the most successful, economic relationship on earth, with the daily trade going back and forth across the borders. If you look at the uncertainty that targeting all of these other big global economic players with these tariffs today, it is, according to some of the analysis we've had on this show today, it is engineering the environment for a global recession, and it's all by choice. Do you see it as that severe a risk to the world economy right now?
Yes, I'm very, very worried about this. And it's not only going to affect the Canadians, it's going to affect the people in the United States. You know, I can remember George Shultz, who was a wonderful Secretary of State, saying, you know, we ought to try to make North America stronger, and then we will maintain our leadership. And he really worked at trying to work together, and we would have regular meetings with Canadians in Mexico, and it made a difference. But right now, we've just done a reverse, an absolute U-turn, and have turned on our two great trading partners imposing tariffs. I mean, to impose a 25% tariff on Canada on the excuse of fentanyl, to me, is just amazing.
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of data that would suggest this is just fundamentally a pretext for trade action, right? Because it needs to be an emergency for the president to do it without congressional support, and just the volumes of fentanyl flowing from our country to the United States at proven levels are very low, not to minimize the impact of fentanyl, but as a trade issue, it doesn't make tremendous sense. But, you know, Ambassador, when you look at what this is going to mean for your economy, what it's going to mean for our economy, we're talking, you know, tens of thousands of job losses if this persists. We talk about economic contraction. We talk about disruption of supply chains that took decades to build, to great prosperity for people affected by this. What is the pain point that gets the president to reconsider? Because he's immune from political pressure in that he's not allowed to seek re-election. What is it you think changes the calculation of this administration to live up to the spirit of the trade deal you worked on so long ago?
Well, there will be a reaction here. I've already had discussions with people in Congress where they're very upset. And so, yes, there is a recognition in the United States that this is a crazy policy and that and we can't let it go forward. You know, our Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, gives the authority to the Congress in the United States for levying tariffs, taxes, and we're just ignoring that. That is, this president is. We've never had a president take the positions that this president has. And it's a concerning thing for many, many Americans, and obviously for our friends and allies, none more so than Canada.
I wonder, just as a final point, Ambassador, NAFTA became CUSMA. Who knows what happens next? Do you think this trade agreement survives this presidency, or do you think the days of continental free trade are simply coming to an end because of this protectionist impulse that exists in the White House right now?
Well, as a strong proponent of free and open trade, I will say to you that our credibility has been fractured. And would you make an agreement with me, even to sell my house, if you knew that I had reneged on it several times with others? I don't think so. And so without credibility, you don't have leadership. And I do worry that that fundamental issue is something that our people in a democracy are going to have to stand up and take action to prevent it from going further. And so, you know, as an American, I want to apologize to Canada for the position that the president has taken, but I hope that we shall overcome.
Well, Ambassador, we appreciate the apology, but we know you're not behind all of this, so we accept it, but we do not hold you personally responsible. It's Ambassador Carla Hills, former U.S. Trade Representative and lead U.S. negotiator of the original NAFTA. It was good to meet you. Thank you for being here on such an important day.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to join you, and I can't imagine what George Herbert Walker Bush, who was so keenly interested in trade, how he would react today. I can tell you, he would be very upset.
Ambassador, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Okay, some more reaction here from members of the Prime Minister's Advisory Council. Lana Payne is the national president for Unifor. She was in that Advisory Council meeting earlier today ahead of the president's tariff announcement. Lana Payne, good day, bad day? Like it's I don't know if there are good days anymore. But you know, Mark Carney, you heard him saying, I believe, that this is just going to fundamentally change the international trading system. So even though it's no extra action against Canada, it's a whole bunch of other action that's going to affect Canada no matter what.
Yeah, nobody in Canada should allow Trump to gaslight us into feeling grateful that he didn't smack us harder today. That is for sure. We have a very big problem on our hands, David. We have tariffs on auto. We have tariffs on steel and aluminum. We have a decision that's going to be made on these border tariffs, and they have signaled that they are coming after our sectors one by one by one. So yeah, Canada cannot relent here one bit. We have to continue to push back hard and be strong.
What do you think the Prime Minister should do tomorrow in responding to this? Because while there is no additional action, there is always the ongoing threat of additional action. And the ones that were in place are still in place, and the ones that were threatened are still coming. What would you advise the Prime Minister to do?
A couple of things. I think he needs to continue to be calm, cool, and collected as he has been throughout this. I believe that from the perspective of workers, they are going to expect him to have a strong response in terms of how we protect auto jobs, how we protect, because auto is in the crosshairs right now, but other sectors will be in the crosshairs coming up. Lumber, pharmaceuticals, you name it. This president has said he's coming for it. So the reality is this is the start of what is going to be a very difficult situation. And I think he needs to signal to corporations in the auto sector and in other places that if they're going to appease Trump by giving in to their illegal and unjustified tariffs, by shifting production out of Canada into the United States, that they are going to face penalties for doing that.
You know, Lana, I'm looking at what the president is saying and what he's doing and what his stated objectives are. And looking at it from this side of the border, it seems to me, and maybe this is too reductionist, I don't know, that he wants our market, he wants to sell us things, he wants us to provide natural resources, but he does not want us as a partner, does not want us as a competitor. It's really just as a client and a supplier. It seems to be the nature of the relationship he is seeking with a lot of his big trading partners.
I mean, the reality is, David, he doesn't get to have it both ways. I mean, this is the thing. He has just declared economic war on most of the world right now, except for Russia and a few other favored friends. And the reality is, Canada will have to respond to this trade war. And by the way, we have been leading the way, I believe, in the world in terms of how you deal with situations like this. Europe has been following suit. Germany has been following suit. We need other countries to also push back against the United States, which was why it was so important for Canada to do what it has been doing. But in the medium term, what we're going to see in the coming days and weeks and months are corporations making decisions based on these tariffs.
Right.
And that is what I'm concerned about, how that impacts our members and all workers in Canada, and how do we prevent these corporations from giving up on Canada in order to appease Donald Trump. That is the big question, and we're going to have to deal with that as a country.
Appeasing Donald Trump is one option. Negotiating with him, defying him, confronting him. There's a range of options there. But with whatever happens on April 28th with the election and afterwards, Mark Carney and Pierre Poilievre have both said they're going to need to start a large-scale renegotiation of this trading relationship, because this month-by-month, tariff-by-tariff, threat-by-threat, pause-by-pause is no way to do anything. So, I mean, when you look down the road to what happens after the election, is that the best outcome right now? That this is, it seems like a negotiation is inevitable in his second term, that it starts as quickly as possible, try to just get the rules of engagement locked down as soon as we can.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful not to negotiate too quickly, David. This is a president who has dominant power right now. It'll be different in 2 years from now when he's facing, elections in Congress and all of those sorts of things. I think we have to look at the window. Yes, we can get to a bargaining table, but we're dealing with a lot of concessions right now.
Yeah.
We are dealing from a position of having tariffs already on us. And is that really the strongest negotiating position that we could be in? I suggest probably not. So, this is going to require a lot of strategic thought and I think a very deliberate approach by Canada. And what I've seen so far, I have liked. We have not gone to appease this president. We have instead held our own and held it well. And I would say Canadians have played a very large role in that, by being unified and by showing their solidarity, and by organically doing things like not taking vacations in the United States, buying Canadian, and now we have to shift from what it is this trade war is going to do and how we get to building a more resilient Canadian economy. And we've got so many resources and
Right.
so much leverage to be able to do that, David.
Yeah, appeasement doesn't seem to work. It just becomes the starting point for more concessions, is the impression I have.
Absolutely.
All right, Lana Payne, always appreciate the time. That's the national president of Unifor, Lana Payne. David Patterson is Ontario's representative in Washington. We had a very good conversation a few weeks back, walking us through what it is the Americans wanted and expelled out on that meeting you were in, David Patterson. How do you fit what we heard today into your understanding of the president's goals now?
Well, I think we've been expecting this day, and it's a monumental day globally, as the Prime Minister said, and also caught Lana's remarks. And there's obviously huge concern and work to be done with our steel and aluminum and other industries. But there's also some good news in terms of the work that we've been doing, and certainly the work that Premier Ford's done with Secretary Lutnick and others. And it really has rested in the Premier's argument that USMCA compliant companies should not be getting tariff application in the same way that others that are not USMCA compliant. Right. We saw that in 3 ways today, and I think it's important to call those out because I think they are victories for Premier Ford. One is, and we've seen this previously, that there's been a significant sort of reduction for Ontario's auto sector in that the application of tariffs is only on the portion that is not U.S. content. And because our automakers do have 50% content in Ontario, that gives a very significant relative competitive
Does that
advantage.
mean a 12% tariff, as you understand it, Dave Patterson? Is that how you see it?
Yes.
Is that what we're talking about there?
12.5.
Yeah, okay.
12.5. And so effectively, if you've got the tariff is only applied on the non-U.S. Content of the vehicle, and those vehicles, all 5 makers, will have 50% content. So effectively, it gives us in the range of a net 12.5% tariff. But then in addition to that, very important, we have the continuation of the USMCA compliance, again, exemption for the fentanyl tariffs. We were very worried that if we had a stacking of that 25% tariff as well as the auto tariffs, that could be curtains for our auto sector, but we didn't have that today. Same argument from Premier Ford. It should not be, USMCA compliance matters. And then USMCA compliance, thirdly, got us a 0% tariff on the reciprocal tariffs when we see others getting 50%, 46% around the world. So again, on a relative basis, this is significant progress, but lots of work to be done. There's questions to be figured out with regard to auto parts, which are duty-free still at the moment. We have to figure those out. And obviously lumber and steel and the others, but it started with that discussion here in Washington between the Premier and Secretary Lutnick.
But, David Patterson, and I've got to get to Flavio Volpe before I run out of show. It tells you how much things have changed. That we're looking at a 12.5% tariff on cars as relief and a victory with the level of disruption that this has caused. When you're in a free trade agreement, you've had the auto pact for decades. The hit to the global trading system right now is also going to be felt in Canada. So there's a lot of difficult times ahead just because of those other actions today.
Yeah, no question. And we've been hearing that from President Trump for 2 years. So we should be prepared. And it doesn't mean we like it, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to try and renew the USMCA eventually. But in the short term, we had a crisis that would have cost us our auto sector, and it won't now. You'll hear concerns from the parts industry in Canada. We understand that. We want to make things better for them as well. But for those that are really driving the jobs, it's the major automakers that do that, and then parts follow. So this is, for the Ontario economy, a very good step forward.
Okay, well, David Patterson, we appreciate that. Still a lot of uncertainty there, a lot of things to be figured out. How do you administer these tariffs that require this dissection of cars? But at least it wasn't another trade bomb today directly related at Canada. So David Patterson, the Ontario representative in Washington. Thank you, sir. We'll check in with you again, I think, throughout this week. We appreciate your time.
Thanks, David.
All right, standing by is Flavio Volpe, who is the president of the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association and also a member of the Prime Minister's Council on Canada-U.S. Relations. Flavio Volpe, David Patterson feels relatively good today about what this means for the auto sector. How do you and your members feel with what happened today?
Well, David sounds a little confused for someone who was in the auto sector before, because take off the IEEPA border tariffs and this reciprocal business today that has USMCA exemptions. You still have steel and aluminum tariffs on also derivative parts, which may be steel and aluminum auto parts at 25%. We don't know because this administration is going so fast. They said CBP will figure it out on a piece-by-piece basis. And I can't believe I just heard Ontario's representative in Washington say it's a good thing that we only have 12.5% tariff in an industry that is 6 or 7% profit margin. That's both sides of the border.
Right.
We get everybody USMCA compliant, David, because we say, if you don't, you got to pay 2.5%. 2.5 on 6 is so tough. everybody's USMCA compliant.
12 and a half is death, though. 12 and a half is losses, right? You're losing money.
12 and a half is gonna close the industry on both sides of the border, like the Ambassador Bridge blockade did. And that's not just me. That's S&P Global. That's Cox Automotive. That's Wedbush. That's Lana Payne, who knows the auto industry because she's in it.
Mm-hmm. So I have to ask you, while I've been doing this sort of roller coaster ride for the last hour and a half, I did look at what you posted on Twitter, and this has to do, or X, whatever you want to call it, has to do with your understanding of when these tariffs will come in on the auto parts, and you put May 3rd on the table as a key date. Like, do these not come in at midnight on Kuzma parts and cars? What happens between now and the 3rd of May? Walk me through that.
Well, the context here is these guys are making it up as they go. So what they said was, and this is in the text that they just posted in their proclamation, they said, all cars are subject to a 25% tariff now, all imported cars, regardless of where they come from. Until they figure out how to get the U.S. content tracked, and they've said that Commerce and CBP will work on that over the next 30 days. So on or before May 3rd.
Right.
Until then, automotive parts that are USMCA compliant are exempt. And then they also said within 90 days, the parts that we haven't already listed, and you'll see in that annex, powertrain components, really major ones, we'll be able to articulate all of them, but we need 90 days. Well, they could also just pull the chapter and the automotive rules of the USMCA, which they have in their hands, and they pass as legislation. So when people say, well, auto parts are exempt because they're USMCA compliant. Well, they're exempt for 30 days or less.
Right.
And half of the parts that we make in Canada are put into into vehicles that are made in Canada that won't be sold to the US because one of two things will happen. American buyers aren't going to pay 25% more, or the industry's going to shut down. Pick your poison.
Okay, so I've followed this as closely as I think any journalist, and my head is spinning trying to figure this out, that they have pushed this off again, essentially. This is like another pause with another threat based on more work being done. But the way you explain it, I've compared this to vivisection of a car to try to figure out which part you're going to tariff and not tariff. This seems the juice would not be worth the squeeze. This would be such a burden to administer and deal with, and the economic knock-on effect of it would be so severe. There is no point in doing this if you're the United States. Am I misunderstanding the administrative burden and the economic fallout?
You're right.
Okay.
Right now, every car company knows, and it's public information, how much of the content in the car they make is American. So today, every automaker says, okay, this one's 10 points, this one's 12 points, this one will be 15 points. All of which is a multiple of their profit. And you can't lower the price or squeeze your suppliers to get it cheaper. The way a surtax or a tariff gets administered is you have to cut a check as the importer of record to CBP. So who's coming up with that? Maybe tomorrow they will. Maybe the day after they will. Maybe for a couple of more days while they beg the White House to try not to embarrass the president. But at some point, on a publicly traded company, if you're booking losses that are in the millions at every assembly plant, and that's what we're talking about, $3, $4, $5, $8 million a day per production plant, you have a fiduciary obligation to your shareholders not to burn their money. We're not China. These are not charities.
Yeah.
We don't, the mint isn't going to print you more money. You're going to run out. So you either have to stop production or you have to run and get an emergency stay in court, or do both.
This, I'm looking for a word I can say on television, Flavio Volpe, in the 30, this is nuts, in the 30 seconds we have left. Like Mark Carney, when he came out and said, this is going to fundamentally change international trade. And it may be an understatement in terms of what the fallout of this if the U.S. goes ahead with everything.
Yeah, what's more to say? I had a meeting of the Canada-U.S. Prime Minister's Council, and we all said, okay, let them put everything on the table so that we can do all the math, just to know how badly they've just hurt themselves and their own economy. And then let's come up with a response without reacting. Right. And that's where we are.
All right, Flavio Volpe, I'm out of show. There's a whole lot more to talk about, and we're going to call you again because we'll hear what the Prime Minister has to say tomorrow. And thanks for being here. That's Flavio Volpe with the Automotive Parts Manufacturers Association. I'm David Cochran. Thank you for watching Power and Politics. We're going to be back in 22 hours, and who the heck knows what's going to happen between now and then. But as for now, Hannah Mansing Tonight is up next on CBC News Network, so stay tuned for more coverage on this from Ian and his team. Thank you.